Since you're going to the air.
Bring us back together. Let me just make a note here. So just to do a sound check, can you hear us online? Great, thank you. I will say I was taking notes as we were discussing whys, and I just wanted to kind of say at the next meeting I'll probably add them as discussion points because I thought there were some really interesting policy questions.
Creates some difficulty just because your subscriptions are often based on your enrollment for school. So
what system are you on?
Well, we have our.
So Bruce and Joanne are like getting into a great discussion about the schools and things. Did anyone online have any comments or questions or anything in the room now that it's just kind of us just chatting a little bit? I did make note that I would like maybe at our May meeting to talk about things like what are the consequences of adopting a system that's built around the patron? Because I think there's the floating collection issue, there's workflows that would need to change, there's managing patron privacy, there's also the equity of having, different, I know that's kind of become an issue sometimes. It's like one city, one county purchasing materials, yet they're going across the state and they're living in other libraries where those patrons didn't purchase those materials. So that's another issue we would need to talk through. And how would we manage that? And then also just the practical, how do we handle the movement of materials? Does anyone else have anything they think would be good to discuss about this, just following up in May about this concept and what it would mean for us? Because I think it is a pretty big paradigm shift, even though it doesn't seem like it when you watch their presentation. Did you have something, Sarah? Or
I guess what I was curious of what would be, I know that the overall goal is to let the system do some of the work so that staff has more time to interact with patrons and other projects, but I was just curious on what the sort of upfront commitment for the implementation, which would have been a good question for Ty, but I'm sure the answer would depend on the size of the library and everything, and then also for training new staff and just what different libraries thought that the reality of getting the best use out of that. I mean, I think it looks really cool, but a lot of times you buy a new system and then everyone's excited about it for a month and then it kind of fizzles out. Maybe that would be, the state library would be helping people through that, I guess.
Absolutely, and when you talk about the implementation being for the shared catalog and other libraries who would want to join on, then that implementation is huge to think about, and any kind of potential future partnerships like with Trails and other kinds of groups. Big would be certainly a goal for any kind of transition like that would be to take a huge ship and figure out how to, it's not even moving the ship, it's literally taking everybody off one ship and moving them onto another, and that's huge.
The old byword used to be never buy model one of anything, version one of anything. But in some ways, this isn't version one. It's my impression is this has been around for at least a decade. Is that correct in the Netherlands? But seeing something like this in the flesh would be interesting. I sure do like the idea of having a system that's oriented around patrons rather than around stuff and around collections. That's from a really high level, sort of almost abstract point of view, makes perfect sense. I did note when Ty was talking about it, he still was talking about collections, right, at times?
Well, that's what I was going to say. I mean, I don't think that fundamentally there's much that's different. It's how they're talking about it. It's how they're talking about using the tools and resources. Some of the things like the integrated workflow management reporting that some of us get from external third-party vendors, having that integrated is new. But much of what's there exists in our current systems. They're talking about it in a different way, and that's interesting. The other piece that's not there yet, but that we've been told might be coming in future iterations, is larger demographic data that goes beyond patron data to more community demographic data. And I mean, I think that's the piece that's missing right now to make it truly customer, patron, community centric, as opposed to this sort of hybrid patron collection system.
So the people online, because I want to make sure that they get a chance, money was mentioned, and then there was a question about, is this being targeted to all libraries or just the MSC? I'm sure OCLC would be targeting it to all libraries. I think we thought of MSC just because that's our consortium model, and that's what we're curious to see what that would mean for us if we were to move to this. I was kind of intrigued because when they were talking in October, I think it's cool to build a system around the patron, and I wanted to know, what does that mean to them? And I think that Jenny's right. There's still some really traditional aspects to it. That's like a traditional ILS. But I actually think about how Montanans use our stuff, and I could see just the way Montanans use libraries here forcing it to work as a patron-driven system. And I'm curious to know how we would manage that and what that would mean. And then the other comment was Dana said, you know, she's disappointed that schools won't be part of the initial rollout. And I think that's a good point. And yes, Elizabeth, you can comment based on, you know, just interrupt. It's okay. We're kind of used to it.
I'm not sure about Dana's question.
Well, speak then? May I speak then? I can't tell who's talking and who isn't. So you had asked if we had any other comments just or observations. And while I recognize that this isn't a very ambitious system compared to other projects that are ongoing, just to sure that part of our response takes into consideration where, if any kind of duplications might be occurring, either with BCA or some of the discussions that we've had regarding the acquisitions project.
Yeah, I thought about the cooperative collection development too, Elizabeth, and how you would almost need to have that in place if this thing's really moving collections around. You'd have to kind of begin to think statewide. I just want to say, because I know, go ahead.
No, thank you. That was my only comment. Yeah.
I think we should clarify the question about school integration with them. My understanding was that there is more of an open educational resource platform that can be integrated into WISE that's not ready, but that schools could potentially still make use of it. But I don't know enough to know what other kinds of functionality, for example, schools might want to see. So I think that would be something we could clarify with them.
Okay.
My sense, this is Bruce. My sense is that in some libraries, some of the differences that used to be really distinctive differences between school and public are starting to evaporate. I was just at a large public library a week ago, and they were talking about no longer organizing their material using Dewey Decimal, which is sort of I've heard that from school libraries as well, using sort of a more subject bookstore sort of model. So again, you know, it's hard for us librarians to think about this without thinking about it as librarians, but if you think about it from a patron's point of view, the patron doesn't really care how things are organized as long as they can find it and take it home. And as we move into an increasingly electronic, digital environment for materials, you know, the whole thinking about shelving is also increasingly less important. The kind of issues that you brought up, Tracy, in terms of sort of, if it is one big library, what's the one big collection development policy, and how do we manage that, and how do we pay for it? Those are more fundamental questions that actually I think the NAC is the perfect group to take and begin to wrestle with. I mean, especially if the NAC would come at it, and this is actually more of a prayer than anything, from a, yeah, this is a hard problem, but we're going to make it work sort of attitude.
And then Carly had said, I think that it would be very useful for us to have the demographic data. She's commenting on Jenny's mentioning that. There just isn't that kind of demographic data even to be bought because Montana is so rural and such a small market. And then Mary Kay says, what do you mean by a collaborative collection? And Mary Kay, what I was talking about, oh, there we go, Kara answered it. Did that answer your question, Mary Kay? When Kara said we're looking at a collaborative collection development project? There's a small subgroup of libraries who expressed interest to me in trying cooperative collection development. And we haven't even had our first initial meeting to talk about what that would look like and what it would do. But they are interested in seeing if they can come together and pay the same prices for materials because they're buying a lot of the same items and they're paying different prices. And what would that look like and how could they use their money more efficiently? And Elizabeth, if you want to weigh in on that one, go ahead.
No, my point was just merely when looking at hearing about the unrolling of new major projects like WISE. There's a lot of noise in the the industry right now with a lot of different vendors coming forward with different proposals and projects, and I was just cautioning that we don't end up with any kind of duplication of services. So.
Yeah, I do get what you're saying. I think for me what this is interesting is it's an opportunity for us to really talk about the future and is this the way of the future and what would it mean for us in Montana to attempt to build something built around the patron, leaving the collections kind of behind because we have traditionally always organized around our collections and then our patrons come in and use them and what does that mean? And I think that to me is a really interesting conversation to have. Whether or not WISE is the tool to get us there or we even need that, I don't know. What I do think is it made me kind of think about those questions, and that's what I found interesting about it. And I see there's another. So Carly says this is the cooperative purchasing pilot modeled on systems in Australia that have a very cost-effective purchasing power due to scaling up to buy together. Somewhat, Carly, it's also one of the more immediate models I have is Wyoming. They actually do something like this too. Any other final thoughts or comments on the WISE that you would like me to capture for us to discuss? Yes, Sarah.
I was curious at the beginning, and maybe this could be a silly question, but I remember in our last meeting, and there was discussion of how the relationship and services of OCLC had evolved somewhat, and you were looking to hear from them about the aspects that you used to like. So how did this meeting come about that? Did you follow up with them and they said, hey, we want to share this new thing with you, or?
I reached out to the gentleman that came in October. His name is Scott. And he was very willing to come and talk to us. And it was definitely me trying to reconnect, because they did used to be far more like partners, and then it sort of moved into a vendor relationship model. And in the past, when they were our partners, they really kind of helped us. I mean, it seems like we use this every day, but the whole statewide group purchasing of OCLC and being able to copy catalog and interlibrary loan, that was new. That had never been done before. And now we use it and we're so used to it and we rely on it. And so it's kind of like, could OCLC again be a partner that could help us keep moving forward and help us do the next step? That maybe 10 years from now we'll think, well, geez, of course it was obvious we should have done that. I would say for me personally, my experience with my interactions with Scott and Michelle and Ty and Maruto was very hopeful. OCLC had sort of it seemed to me, had made this turn in the road where they were just more focused on academic libraries, and that's fine. That was their purpose and their focus. This is probably the first time they clearly are interested in reconnecting with public libraries and coming back to the fold, and I myself was much more hopeful about the possibilities of partnering with them and having them be a partner again, helping us to kind of leverage our strengths with theirs to do good stuff.
And did their description of the whys, did that feel like, I mean, that would be another partnership thing, or is that more of like, I don't know if you can tell.
That's a good question. I think they were very interested in partnering with us and trying it. We talked about that because they came and talked to the state library staff and talked to the shared catalog staff. And I think it's the practical details. We did that once before with their world share management system, and I need to talk to some people who went through that process to see how it worked. Because it would have to be something like that if we were to go that way.
But I think what's one thing that's sort of telling is that they're talking about WISE as a public library system. And if it's really oriented around the patron, it's not anything library system, it's a patron system. It's a system that will, it seems like its big opportunity it would be to enable sort of a more functional management tool for consortia that would be multi-type. I mean, the type really shouldn't matter. And the fact that they're sort of talking about it as a public library thing, and they're going to run it out, and they're going to take it and show it off first at PLA, to me is sort of telling. My guess is that it came from a kind of a completely public library environment in the Netherlands, I'm guessing. Because at one point, when I knew about that kind of stuff, that they did have sort of a separate system. Our role might be to help them think about it as a consortial system instead of as a public library system, and probably to the degree that we can help them do that, might be a system that would be useful to us.
I think that's a really, really good point, Bruce. I only half-jokingly yesterday said to them that the best part of my day was to hear that they had a public library strategy, because I agree with Tracy. I think they had really taken a step in a different direction, and we had actually had them confirm that. One of the things that Ty said yesterday that I think goes to Bruce's point is that as they were approaching the needs of public libraries, they looked across the spectrum of ILSs that were available, and they liked WISE. So I think that, again, reiterates that they're looking at the need to re-engage with public libraries and looking at WISE as a tool to do that. So your point about helping them think about OCLC's role in the larger library paradigm rather than at different types of libraries and tools as the entree into that work is something where I think we can give them a little bit different perspective.
If I were they and they were really interested in broadening their product, that they are cooperative for libraries, if they were interested in broadening it, I would look at Montana as an amazing test bed, a place to really, I would deploy the troops. I would set up an OCLC office in Helena or Bozeman or Missoula. Because in some ways, like you were saying, Tracy, Montana libraries are more or less beyond the idea of wondering whether cooperative library services are a good idea. We say, yeah, that's probably a pretty good idea. We're kind of at we are at the stage where we can take the next step. It seems to me that OCLC hasn't aligned this with that next step, but that it would possibly be alignable. And helping them kind of realize that would be good for them, but it would be great for us. Well, actually, vice versa. It'd be really good for us, it would be great for them, because that would let them take and basically promulgate better public library services, and library services generally around the world.
I'm going to read a couple of comments from online, but one thing I would say, kind of in answer to your question, Sarah, is, the NAC in the 5-year LSTA plan, they had that goal about following someone from birth to end of life through all the different types of libraries and having it be a more seamless flow. And I think that little, like, WISE and the whole idea of it being built around the patron, that to me is how you have to get to that. I don't know that WISE is the tool. Maybe it is, maybe it's not, I don't know. But if we really mean we'd love to build a seamless experience for people, then we have to build systems around people. And so I think if nothing else, I found this valuable for me in terms of like thinking about what does that mean for us as libraries to do that. So I just want to share Carol is on this meeting as well, and she says the MSC is required to go out for an RFP again in about 3 years. It is interesting and necessary to think now about what is on our ILS/patron experience wish list and what we need to start doing on our end in order to prepare so that we can consider these other possibilities, which I think is a good point, Kara. And then Carly says, this is way better than their World Share Management pilot. They've advanced light years since then and are much more public friendly. And Mary Kay says, I think this would work well in Montana's more urban areas that are closer together. I think it would isolate even more the more rural areas. So it's a really interesting thing, Mary Kay. Do you mind sharing more? And if you want to go with your mic, that's fine.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay. What I want to explain by that is okay. Now can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, we can.
Am I gone?
So,
okay.
Wasn't an echo, please?
What I've noticed is in the time that I have been the director here, with my situation specifically, and to where I'm not connected with an interstate, and I'm kind of in between two communities, and I've seen it even when you go further east of Colstrip, so like when you get to Broadus and those areas too. When you're not connected by a main road, although I guess you could call 212 a main road, there is a certain isolation anyway. And if the purchasing for the librarians or the libraries leaves the hand of the local libraries and becomes a statewide program, I think the purchasing would maybe eventually trickle down and get to those smaller libraries in the more rural areas, but it would be a long time. And I'll use Partners as an example. Partners works well for us sometimes, but when one of my patrons place a hold on an item, they sometimes wait 6 to 8 weeks or longer. And when we send out an item, we send it out the next day. So I just see this as a way of, I can see that there's benefits for different areas. I think it would be really hard on areas like my community. And I know Colstrip's not the only community that's like that. There's other communities, but I do see it as being an isolating factor, especially if you can't get the materials to the libraries in a quick manner.
Thank you, Mary Kay.
That's all I have to say.
So I added a question of like, how do we manage the kind of rural urban parts of this in a way that's equitable? And I think what you're getting at is we almost would have to solve the movement of material first. And I also think that when we talk about cooperative collection development, I mean, really, I know in my mind, I'm thinking of the Montana Library to Go model, where you have different representatives of different sizes and types of libraries coming together just to make sure that we get that representation as well. But I think that's a really good point, and Eva agreed with you. And of course, she's up in Harlem. So.
It almost sounded, this is Bruce, it almost sounded like the WISE system is acting in sort of a quasi-artificial intelligence way as a recommender. I see your library's patrons are borrowing a lot of books on hunting. You've got this many, there seems to be demand which is in excess of that. You might want to consider buying more books on hunting. The question, one of the details I'd be interested in learning with the WISE thing is how that sort of recommender system would scale up to a consortia, to a partner-like group, or to a statewide group. who are doing collection development. It seems like to your point, Mary Kay, that the success of this is not perhaps best viewed by looking at whether it increases or decreases local control. Success would be what you said in addition. You said how quickly materials are getting into the hands of your patrons. So, to the degree which it makes, finding and asking for stuff more convenient and faster, and if stuff gets into your patrons' hands faster, it's good. In terms of exactly how the materials are decided, how librarians decide what materials to buy, that's actually in some ways kind of a secondary question. That's the important details, but it's not the root. It's not how we decide whether it's working or not.
And that leads to Carly had a question. She said, "This isn't how I understood the cooperative collection development. I thought there was local control. Did I misunderstand?" And I think, Carly, the model in Wyoming is very much built on local control. The other models that we've seen, I would say, are blended with quite a bit of local control, but also an acknowledgement that almost everyone buys in public libraries certain bestsellers that all patrons read. And so that's kind of like, Baker and Taylor calls it already yours, I believe. Just kind of items you're going to purchase that you could do automatically, and that's part that might be more of a shared model. I don't think we know enough of the details to know how this is going to look, because we haven't even had that initial meeting to say, if we wanted to do this in Montana, what would that look like?
And I think just out of the box, any strategy that disadvantages small rural libraries is off the table.
Yep.
Just speaking as a commissioner,
Yep.
that would just be exactly the wrong direction.
Yeah, that's definitely would agree with that. This needs to benefit, I would like it to benefit all libraries and all of the people they serve. That's my idealist side. So I'll just call for any final comments or questions. Okay. So we are at about 5 minutes to 12. The next item on our agenda is the State Library update, but I wanted to kind of check with the people in the room because our lunch has been delivered. Do you want to take like 20 minutes or so, 30 minutes to have lunch and then reconvene? Would that be helpful, or do you want to eat through lunch? Or work through lunch, I mean.
What's going to work best for the agenda?
Well, probably if Jenny and I could tag team, we could work through lunch. I could grab a bite to eat right now, and then when Jenny's done, I'll probably be done, and then she can eat, and I can keep running the meeting. Let me just check for those of you who are online. Do you need to take off? Okay, looks like one of you do. But do any of you need to have lunch or be somewhere between 12 and 12:30, or do you mind if we work straight through and get done sooner? So it looks like some online folks, it varies. It's like 50-50.
Oh no. No.
That makes like some people are like, I need to leave, and some people are like, let's work through. So
let's take a break then.
yeah, let's take a half an hour. You can walk your puppies, grab some food, and we'll eat in here, and then we'll reconvene at 12:25. Okay? So we'll see you back online at 12:25.
Which is really interesting.
All right, so this is Tracy, kind of reconvening us at around 12:25. Who do we have online? Anyone back? Obviously, all of us in the room are still here, which is Jenny, Bruce, Joanne, Sarah, and myself. It's back. Okay, great. All right, good.
This is Sonia.
Cool. So I am going to actually move on to the next agenda item, which is the State Library update. So I'm going to have Jenny begin that.
Great. Thanks, Tracy. I have, I think, 4 things I want to talk to you briefly about today. The first of which are a couple of our procurement processes that we are going through that we've been talking to you about. The first one being the formation of a nonprofit. We've been talking about this idea at the State Library for about a year now, and it's really, really coming to fruition. Last summer, we conducted a study of some different options that the State Library could think about to help form what at the time we were referring to as a foundation with the idea of an endowment. I think the largest idea behind this nonprofit is really well set in our mind. It's the idea that through some external nonprofit private funding mechanism, we have funding that supports the Montana Library and Information community in the same way that we try to provide foundational, technological, and programmatic infrastructure across the state. So models like the Montana Shared Catalog and our OCLC group services and Montana Library to Go, the early literacy program, our lifelong learning programs, those elements of our work that we'd like to try to really think about benefiting all libraries in the state. We hope that this idea of a nonprofit will similarly benefit all libraries in the state at that kind of statewide level. You know, I would love to reach a point where we could just say that to be a member of the Shared Catalog, there's no cost. To make use of OCLC services, there's no cost. Those kinds of things are just funded. We know that from a public funding perspective, that's not likely to happen. And in our review and thinking last summer, we came to the conclusion that there is a potential workable model there through the formation of a nonprofit. And at the same time, we were fortunate last summer to receive a couple of donations to the State Library Trust that has given us the resources to kind of springboard this idea. Over the course of last fall, we worked with Ned Cooney, a contractor out of Big Fork, to help us really solidify the work that needs to be done to form a nonprofit, and it was with his guidance that we backed away from referring to this idea as a foundation and are thinking about it more as a nonprofit for now, and with the idea that the group that's responsible for getting this entity off the ground needs to go through a process of creating both the funding and the fundraising policies and priorities, and that through that work, it will determine the best sort of legal kind of entity that we might be forming, and from there, exactly how funds would be both raised and then eventually dispersed. So that's why we're referring to it as a nonprofit. I want to be very clear that when I say a nonprofit, we're not in any way intending to compete with something like the Montana Library Association. This is not intended to be a professional association in the way that MLA operates. This is going to be very specifically dedicated to funding, and maybe at some point in the future, MLA actually becomes a funding partner, but not competing with MLA. We're also very cognizant that we don't want to compete with local library foundations and local friends groups. We've worked hard to include communication from those groups as we've gone through our thinking. Leslie Modrow from the Billings Public Library Foundation sat on our RFP committee to help us select a contractor. Again, I hope that as we think about funding these kinds of statewide efforts, it frees up a local community friends group or foundation to focus on those kinds of local community funding needs in much the same way we think about scaling the work of the state library. So we went through an RFP process over the course of the winter. And I'm very excited to announce that as we speak, a contract is being routed for signature with Library Strategies. They have been selected to help us form this nonprofit. We're using some monies from our State Library Trust to enter into an 18-month contract with Library Strategies with the idea that at the end of 18 months, we will have a separate legal entity that's formed, that is branded, that has fundraising policies in place, that has funding priorities in place. Our intent is to work with a steering committee that can morph into a nonprofit board that will help guide the direction of the nonprofit. The state librarian and at least one commissioner will have a seat on that board, and we anticipate that broad representation from the library community as well as the foundation community would also be represented on that board. In thinking about the procurement process, one of the needs that Library Strategies brought to our attention was engaging in the philanthropic community here in Montana as well, and so we're grateful for that expertise. Ideally, at the end of 18 months, this entity is actually raising money to the point where we can hire an executive director and have something that's operating on its own, raising money towards the goals that are identified. It may take many, many years before the nonprofit begins to actually distribute funds. Again, that's going to be largely determined by the board that's put forward. But we really see this as something that's building towards the future for funding needs for the library community, thinking about our future patrons, our future communities, and moving forward from there. If you're not familiar with Library Strategies, they're a very, very interesting model. They are technically a part of the Friends of the St. Paul Public Library in Minnesota. They raise money for the work of the St. Paul Public Library, and one of their funding mechanisms is as consultants. They have broad expertise in supporting foundations and friends groups, in helping libraries do strategic planning, in capital investment, and a wide variety of services. And they essentially sell that expertise as consultants to the national library community. And as a nonprofit, the funds that they raise go back into the St. Paul Public Library Friends Group. So they have just incredible expertise to share with us, and we feel incredibly fortunate that they've been selected to help us with this process. One of their consultants, Karen Rose, will be at the MLA conference next month, though she'll be meeting with the State Library Commission. She'll be at our Conversations with the Commission session on Thursday morning, and she will also be at the Friends and Foundation Interest Group on Thursday afternoon to begin to have conversations with those groups. So a huge leap forward in that effort in just the last couple of weeks. Any questions? Sure, nothing pops up here.
So I have one question. As you, during the 18-month contract that you have with Library Strategies, are you setting up the board before that, or are you setting up the board after?
Part of their responsibility will be to help us recruit that board.
Okay.
Yeah.
From online probably, so it's great work, thank you.
Great. So the other procurement process that we are in the midst of and nearing completion is for our public awareness campaign. The idea of doing this campaign, of course, was born out of the financial struggles that we had last summer and some expressions that the Montana libraries are non-essential. And we really wanted to change that idea, change that way of thinking, particularly amongst our funders. And so the state library lost our communications and marketing coordinator in the budget cuts that we went through. But we also know that this is an area where we would really benefit from some outside expertise. And so similarly, the State Library Commission authorized us to use some money from the State Library Trust to hire a contractor to help us with about an 18-month public awareness campaign. There's a number of elements to that campaign that we're focusing on. It's will include public awareness about the role and services of the state library, but it is really about the Montana Library and Information community writ large. So in addition to communication about the state library services, we want a contractor to help us with messaging about the importance of information and how libraries provide the avenue to that access to that information. We want to also provide some kind of communication toolkit and messaging and training that local libraries can use within your local communities for information and sharing and advocacy within your local communities. And the other thing that we're asking a consultant to help us with is to build a coalition of support that goes beyond the library community. So we know who our partners are, who are able to advocate on behalf of our libraries before our funders throughout the upcoming campaign as we head into the legislative session. So it's really a targeted public awareness and advocacy campaign where we have both some common messaging that we can use across the state as well as really customizable messaging that we can use within our local communities, the training to go along with it to help make sure librarians and boards are comfortable making use of the tools that are made available to them, and then thinking beyond the library community to developing this coalition of support around the state. That procurement process, the bid process has closed. We received 7 responses to that RFP, and we're currently in the middle of scoring those. We have a meeting scheduled for next week where we'll actually hopefully select a consultant that we can move forward to contract negotiations with. And if all goes well, we'd be able to have that consultant at MLA as well. Any questions about that effort? Similarly, we plan on working with the steering committee for that effort, and that would certainly be multi-type, multi-size, statewide representation.
It's encouraging to see these things start to come together.
It really is. It really is. Yeah. And I'm one of the scorers on the procurement process for the public awareness campaign, and we got some top-notch responses. So I'm pretty excited. I don't think legally I can say more than that, but I'm pretty excited. So normally at this time of year, spring of even-numbered years, we'd be talking about the budget process that the state library is going through as we plan for our budget priorities for the upcoming legislative session. And at the direction of the governor's budget office, agencies will not be going through a traditional budget planning process, what we normally refer to as the executive planning process. In the past, we've had the opportunity to prepare sort of a wish list of ideas that we would like to see funded. And they're not going to go through that process this next legislative session, largely because of concerns over current revenue and the status of the budget for the next biennium. So we're not going through that effort, but we are taking a really deep dive into understanding the funding that goes into funding the work of the state library. The commission has spent a couple of meetings really looking at the specifics of the different kinds of funding we currently have and creating a framework by which we can think about new funding opportunities. So we've really taken that strategic triangle approach that the NAC is very familiar with and applied it to the types of funding that the state library receives or could receive in the future. We've looked at what the funds actually fund and the value that comes from what we fund through the monies like our general fund, like our Library Services Technology Act funding and our Full Service Tech funding. We've talked about our operational ability to administer those funds. We've talked about the political climate that surrounds a lot of those funds and understand that there's in some ways little that we can do to influence that political climate. Hopefully efforts like the public awareness campaign can shift that dynamic somewhat. Beginning at our April Commission meeting and into the summer, we're going to be continuing to talk about what other types of funding mechanisms might exist. The governor's office has said that if there's any new forms of funding, they should be targeted at specific spends. And so in addition to thinking about the sources of the funding, we're trying to think strategically about how we might spend any new monies that come our way. And again, using that strategic triangle to think through our operational capacity as well as the political opportunities that exist around different kinds of funding opportunities. Let me give you sort of a concrete example that one legislative committee is looking at. Our natural resource data that we make available is used in the environmental permitting process, and agencies and others pay fees when they're filing their environmental permitting documents. There's an argument to be made that a portion of that fee could be used to fund the information management for our natural resource information system and our natural heritage program. So that's one example of a type of funding opportunity that has a very specific kind of spend that we're thinking about. And so this summer, the governor's office has said that we should come and be prepared to brainstorm and just put any idea on the table that we have that might help to replace some of the funding that we've lost in new and different ways. I think that's wise counsel as the commission and staff have thought about the nature of our funding, and certainly we were thinking this before we took the budget cuts. We knew we were subject to funding that was incredibly volatile, and we wanted to have more diversity in the funding that comes to the state library to help us weather different kinds of financial troubles. I don't think at the time we anticipated the nature of the troubles that would be before us, but the idea of trying to create a really diversified funding portfolio is something that really makes sense to a lot of us. And so that's where we're spending our time and effort as we head into planning for the legislative process. With regard to the public library state aid, that's a 2-year voidness of the public library state aid, but as long as nobody goes in and monkeys with that legislation in the next legislative session, libraries will begin receiving that state aid in FY20, and then subject to increases from the census, that amount of funding would increase. We are starting to receive some of our coal severance tax funds. That was a legislative change, and as I reported in the fall, we were slowly beginning to receive coal severance tax monies. We've now begun to receive more on not an infrequent but a rather irregular cycle. And so we're learning how to better manage the cash that's flowing into our coal severance tax account. At this point, we've been able to pay our OCLC and our Circe Dynex bills, and we've issued checks to all of the Federation libraries, so those funds have been paid. Next on the priority list is to make some funding available to continue with the digitization of our state publications collection, and some funding that the state library uses to pay for things like our new overdrive collection that the state library makes available to as part of the library professional development collection and so forth. If we have money left at the end of the fiscal year, the plan is to share that with public libraries in lieu of the loss of some of the state aid that they had this year. At this point, revenue projections look good. It looks like we'll have some of that funding available. We certainly don't have it in the account yet, but it continues to come in. So that's where things sort of sit from a budget and budget planning perspective right now. I'm going to pause again and ask if there are any questions.
I should know the answer to this. I don't. So with the coal severance tax funds, as money comes in, are we able to let money accumulate in that account so that we don't have the cash flow problems at the beginning of next fiscal year that we had this year?
We are. The legislation used to require that any unspent monies flow into the general fund. That language was struck, and so anything unspent would stay in that account. Of course, you know, it's a balancing act. You don't want to leave too much and let it accumulate, but from a cash flow perspective, we need to have some ability to better manage those funds.
And you've been able to determine, in theory, what that sort of good balance would be.
Where that's exactly one of the things we're talking about, you know, and thinking, you know, at least enough to pay a couple of those early bills that come in at the start of the fiscal year. So the last thing I wanted to mention, and this is just a continuation of the state library's ongoing effort to really understand the impact and value of our services. We've talked a lot about collecting data. You're familiar with our use of logic models and impact studies and trying to align our work plans to really support outcomes and impacts of the work that we do. We at the State Library are really trying to think about the kinds of information that we manage internally to help us better manage our work, the kinds of information the leadership team has that helps prioritize our work, and the kinds of information we share and report to the State Library Commission that helps them to make sure that they have the ability to do their jobs as commissioners effectively. I think we're doing a better job on the project side, thinking about the outcomes and impacts of individual projects and work that we want to have, and monitoring and evaluating the project-related work. And so one of the things we've turned our attention to are some of the more ongoing regular aspects of our work that we should be reporting on. What are the indications of the success and the health of our agency on an ongoing and regular basis? We've been interviewing members of our commission to get their input on what those metrics are. Certainly there are things like the financial health of the agency and the satisfaction of the staff, for example. The State Library Commission is going to spend some time thinking about what those success indicators are and how we can do a better job of reporting that kind of information to them. And this same idea also applies to our different advisory councils, including the Network Advisory Council. So that's why we have some time on the agenda to kind of think about these questions. You know, from a library development perspective, what are the success indicators for the work that we're doing? And for members of the NAC representing the kinds of libraries you represent, what kinds of things would be helpful for you to know and understand about the library development work that we do, that we can report on, that will help you provide us feedback and advice to further inform our library development work. Let me give you a couple of concrete examples that we've been talking about as staff. One of the things we're responsible for are public libraries meeting standards in order to receive state funding. We have never reported on the number of libraries that are meeting those standards or who are not meeting those standards and which standards they're not meeting, that has a very definite connection to the library development work that we do and whether or not we're being successful in that work. Similarly, we don't report on the number of librarians and board members who are receiving their certification and where they might be having challenges in meeting that certification. Again, those are reflections in some ways of our success in doing library development work. Those are just two examples, and I'm sure that there are plenty of others. And one of the things that we would like to talk to the NAC about is what those success or health indicators might be that you would want to see reported on that can help you help us support library development and help you, we think, in your communication to the libraries you represent that will better inform our overall work. So those are a number of efforts that are underway at the State Library.
I wonder if there's any response from the...
None so far. For those of you who are online, this is Tracy and I am monitoring. Oh, here we go, Kellyanne. That is all very exciting. Love to see you guys making a difference and moving forward.
The final plug I'll mention is at the Library Association Conference, 9:30 Thursday morning is our annual Conversations with the Commission. We're going to talk, I think, in more detail about this idea of success metrics, and then also talk about the nonprofit that we're forming and have library strategies there at that session.
So Mary Kay has a question. Is there an idea about next year's budget? Will they request more cuts?
No idea yet, Mary Kay. Revenue estimates are starting to look better. We're getting monthly reports right now, and each month they're looking more and more optimistic. But I don't think anybody's anticipating any growth in the budget. Right now, though, we're not anticipating any future cuts. Knock on wood. Everybody knock on wood, please.
And I think it's worth noting, even if things were to remain as they are now, a lot of our programs are funded by one funding source. So, for instance, all of our library development is funded. The majority of our library development is funded by Federal Library Service and technology. I was going to do construction technology funds, and general. So we got LSTA, we have general fund, we have coal severance, et cetera, and ideally, programs important for Montanans' well-being would have more than one funding source. Give the state library a little bit more opportunity to rob from Peter to pay Paul if Paul doesn't show up. So. I guess my big concern about funding is sort of a short-term concern, but also a long-term concern that at any one point, if the feds, for instance, decided to close IMLS, the Institute of Museum and Library Services, we would be hard-pressed to take and fund a lot of services which everyone counts on. So it continues to feel like we have sort of a brittle and precarious funding situation, and that's a huge concern to me. It's Bruce.
Any other questions or comments for Jenny?
I have one. Bruce, are you considering the nonprofit group that's hopefully being formed? Do you think that will be able to kind of take care of some of these precarious funding issues we have?
Is this Sonia?
Yes, it is.
Yeah, Sonia, I think eventually it'll help, but I don't think it'll help anytime in the next decade, is my guess, unless, someone who really loves us dies and gets us a passel of money. I mean, to speak bluntly, I think it'll be years before we get some help, and I would anticipate at that point the help would sort of kind of gradually come in. And even if we had, let's say, it turns out that we come up with an endowment that funds a lot of the cooperative services that Jenny was describing, that's still not the whole picture, and it still leaves us in our current sort of semi-fragile situation of being very dependent upon funding sources that we can't really count on for funding vital services. So, in part, yes, it's not all the story. The Commission still feels that in addition to that foundation, nonprofit, whatever it turns out to be, that we need to continue to look, to beat the bushes and try to find other funding sources as well, so that we are, we're tougher. We're less liable with the loss of one or the diminishment of one funding source to take and leave our users in the lurch. That means you as librarians, and it also means some of the patrons that we serve directly, like the folks who are served by the Library for the Blind and the people who are served by our GIS services and our digital library services. So in part, yes, but it's not going to solve all our problems.
One of the things that library strategies opened my eyes to that I hadn't thought about was that this nonprofit entity and with board representation, hopefully from a variety of sectors, could also play an advocacy role for the library community. So in addition to doing the fundraising, they're potentially opening doors for other kinds of partnerships and relationships that might also yield some financial benefit to the library community. That was something that hadn't really occurred to me before, but I think makes a lot of sense if we think about people within the economic development community, for example.
Seems to me that in the long run, the more libraries give patrons what they want, the easier it's going to be for us to take and gather together the money we need to do what our patrons want. It's sort of it's not a chicken or egg. It's impossible to tell what comes first.
So we had a couple of comments online. Kellyanne says, I think that the state library is positioning themselves in a positive way towards our budgets. What I like about what Jenny reported is that the state library is moving forward and continuing to act. And Carly said, I don't know if Jenny was asking, but my thoughts beyond meeting standards and achieving certification of excellent would be to develop a platform for networking among peers, as well as among diverse library communities across the state. And another thought would be to develop a Montana Library Wide Pack to understanding not only what systems and authorities and groups are in place in the state, like OCLC, MSC, etc., and history and place of interaction, but also a shortcut to help develop a vision toward libraries should be headed. Sorry, D doesn't need to be announced, you can just pass to Jenny. But Carly needs a good thought, so any other comments or questions for Jenny? Or Jenny, did you have anything you want to add?
I have a question for the NAC.
Okay.
I mean, what do other advisory council members think that we should be doing differently in addition instead of what we're doing?
Which kind of leads into the next agenda item. Which is about the budget discussions that we had last time. What else should the state library be doing to help you as well as us? I mean, we're kind of all in this together.
I mean, but to back up to my question, I mean, seriously, if people have ideas, please share them. I mean, we don't think we have all the answers. We don't even think we have the majority of the answers, or I don't. I really am looking, if anyone has any half-baked ideas, welcome. love to hear what people have to say.
This is Sonia. I always have this half-baked idea that we ought to do the donate $1 to your library day, and maybe statewide that would pay for something.
Oh, good thought.
Yeah, for sure.
Thank you. maybe instead of a poppy, people could get a little book or something that they wear on their lapel.
Mhm.
Any other thoughts? Well, oh, go ahead.
I always kind of wonder, Bruce, where do you think the commission sees the library world going? You know, part of what we do is based on where you guys think we need to be.
Well, we all have opinions, but we gain our opinions by listening to you. A lot of where Montana libraries have gone in the past was sort of, we were steered in this direction by the Network Advisory Council. And so in the past, and I presume into the future, we continue to rely upon your advice to the commission. In the past, your advice was, it looks to me, it looks to the NAC as if there were lots of opportunities to work collaboratively to improve services and save costs. There was sort of a lot of what we heard earlier today, kind of concerns about privacy and local control. But obviously in the past, many libraries gave up some level of perceived local control to get more bang for their buck. It seems to me that there's a strong impetus in the past to try new things, and some of those things worked and some didn't. But you know, the Montana Library to Go and shared catalog and Montana History Project, all those kinds of things were things that were tried because the Network Advisory Council said give these a shot. I'm not really totally answering your question. I guess my answer succinctly would be the commission would benefit by the Network Advisory Council providing more advice about what sort of a progressive library development looks like in Montana. In the past, the NAC has been able to provide very, very good advice.
Mary Kay says, I think we should be proactive about the whole non-essential service issue and combat it by talking about it. Not to put you on the spot, Kellyanne, but do you want to respond to that? She might not be on.
Oh, no, but here I am. I just took me a minute to find this and stuff. And no, I agree with Mary Kay. I mean, I think that you know, we need to put this stuff forward and not just talk about it. And you know, this is the thing, and this is what I'll say to Bruce too, is just I really think that the state library is positioning themselves a little better right now, because I like to see that there's looking towards some sort of vision. You know, I think we were hit so hard last year and everybody was kind of like dead, you know, deer in the headlights kind of looks and stuff, but I'm actually really not surprised, but I'm just really excited when I hear Jenny talking about the strategy stuff that they're working on and everything. And I think that, you know, if we can get this advocacy working forward for us, this group and stuff, then we will be able to move, I think, very quickly. It just needs to be in place. And so of course, I get strategic planning just is my wheelhouse, and I get really, really excited about it. But I think that we're heading in the right direction, and I like how when Jenny was talking, she was, you know, being positive and saying what she was learning and stuff. And I think that that's kind of what we need to continue to do, is just this action, this moving forward action, and maybe get loud on the advocacy part, like Mary Kay is saying and stuff. I guess, Mary Kay, I was just wondering if you wanted to go a little deeper into that.
Okay, give me a minute. It's can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I'm not really sure what you mean by go a little bit deeper in it. I was thinking like as part of like an advertising campaign, talk about the almost like anti-library agenda and say, well, this is what they're saying and this is what we're saying and this is why we are saying it. I think talking about it with each other, that's fine, but I think the conversation needs to be with our users as well as our non-users and why their public library is important to them. Am I making sense?
No, you're making excellent sense. This is really timely, this whole thing, because the Lewistown Public Library, we're having a public meeting on March 20th. I strategically placed it on the first day of spring, hoping that I would get people to come out and whatnot. But we did a really big survey, and now we have the results of the survey, and we're moving forward with our own personal strategic plan. And so I'm curious to know who comes to this meeting, this public meeting that we're having and stuff, because we have gotten some really, really good feedback from not just our patrons, but people who don't even use the library, which I really pushed because I tried to get everybody to take the survey that I knew or even didn't know, because I wanted to make sure that I was reaching not just our patrons and not just library people, but I was, people who have never even been in the library. And so I'm more than willing to report back and stuff, but it was really interesting what we found out on the survey about how people use the library.
I'm going to read Carly's comment. She says, I think compiling the work and the numbers is important to combat the non-essential, especially all of the service the libraries are providing to fill the gap, job services, health services, tax forms, etc.
Absolutely. One of the other things that goes along with that messaging is to really be mindful of the impact of the added work. Carly provided some great examples, but Montana Public Libraries lost on average 2 to 3% of their budget with the loss of state aid, and many libraries, as we know, are losing additional local funds. And we can't continue to expect that we're going to do more with less, and we absolutely cannot shrug it off and have the message that, we're going to continue to do what we're doing. It's frustrating, but we'll somehow find a way. That's not the right message to continue to convey to our legitimizers. And part of the idea of this public awareness campaign is to help us all craft the kinds of messages that will resonate with our local government leaders and our legislators, so that they understand that there really is an impact to our communities when we face these kinds of budget threats. And that we're not just doing it on our own. We are relying on our patrons and our non-patrons, as was said, and a coalition of people who believe in and value having libraries in our communities as well as access to the information.
Any other ideas, half-baked or otherwise?
This is a half-baked idea, a little more practical maybe. In thinking about laying different kinds of funding options on the table before the governor this summer, they've talked in the past about increasing the amount of bed tax the state collects, or different kinds of taxes that would primarily tax tourists. And we know that tourists are coming into Montana libraries, using the libraries when they're traveling through, particularly for internet access. And so I think it makes sense to make a case for any kind of increased bed tax monies to go to some kind of statewide broadband initiative for all libraries.
Do we know how many libraries, public and otherwise, around the state work with the Department of Commerce, with Travel Montana for touristic type activities?
I'm not aware of any. No, actually, there might be some. In the back of my mind, there is a library, a public library that provides that service.
You know, you can't walk into a hotel without being sort of, buffeted visually by these pamphlet racks of stupid things to do in Montana. But it seems to me that there might be a role for public libraries to have some sort of a role to play in that way. And if we were doing so, it might be easier to make a case for bed tax funds, for instance.
Kellyanne says, I entirely agree that we can't keep saying we will do more with less. I have said before that saying essential services may be the sticking point. We need to reframe that to be more of an engagement than just services. And Carly says, I think this is an answer to your Department of Commerce. We don't work with them, but we serve a lot of touristic travelers.
In Miles City, we're really active with our local Chamber of Commerce.
Any other thoughts on this budget question and any other ideas or questions about what we should do next?
I always just wonder how far short Montana libraries are as a whole in terms of revenues to needs.
How do you quantify needs?
Well, there you go.
So but you raise an interesting question that this is very poor analytical data, but it's something. When we were going through the procurement process, and we got a little bit of information about the Hennepin County library system in Minnesota, which is I think a nice, well-funded.
It's a great library system.
Their annual budget is something like $60 million for this, countywide multi-branch library system. When you look at their population relative to the population of the state of Montana within that county, I'm not going to get the numbers right off the top of my head, but proportionally, as a whole, Montana libraries report receiving approximately the same proportion of funds relative to population, which is it's interesting. It's an interesting way to think about the adequacy of the funding.
So it's probably cheaper for them to provide library services than it is for us.
I would bet.
So maybe the cost difference would be the amount we're short if you compare it to Hennepin County.
Right.
It's just that when we think about we want more money, it seems to me we're always we do pursue kind of individual projects and stuff. It would be nice to have sort of an agreed upon amount to talk about as a library community. So say, as a state, we're $30 million short of what we need, or whatever that magic number was. And the fact that we can't do it, I think, tells us that we still have some work to do. We should have a number, even if it's not a correct number.
Any other comments or questions or ideas? Is there anything, I do want to kind of circle back to that agenda item. Is there anything specifically, given your own funding situations, that you would find particularly helpful to kind of advocate for your own budgets or to negotiate that process? And Carly says there is a national per capita for library funding, so maybe we can compare that with the average state per capita funding total.
I like the idea of when you're working with library strategies and for the toolkit, also for this messaging and crunch time.
Yeah.
Especially if we can't continue business as usual 3 years, tighten up. So,
Yeah.
be helpful.
I think so too.
I think the toolkit and any training that can be offered at the Montana Library can access is it's going to get the most bang for the buck.
I think so too.
This is Kellyanne, and this is just an idea, and it's kind of covers everything that we've just sort of talked about and stuff. But one of the things I hear all the time is that, you know, I have 5 librarians here. 2 of them are part-time, 3 of us are full-time. And people are always like, well, why do you need so many librarians? Why is there so many people in there? You know, can't you just do shift work and whatever? You guys don't really work anyway. You know the whole story. And so sometimes I think that when we do advocacy and we talk about, you know, what the library produces as a library, I think it's really good. But sometimes I also think that we need to humanize what exactly we do as the people who are in the library, because people are mystified by what I do each day. And, you know, whether it's cataloging or whatever, you know, they just assume that all this stuff magically appears. And I think that that might be a situation for advocacy, is if, you know, maybe highlighting librarians, or not just the library, but actually what the people are doing for the community in the library. So, yeah, we don't get paid to read, Mary Kay. I don't take naps in the afternoon, although I've been asked if that's what I do. And anyway, you know how it is. You guys have all heard it. But sometimes I think that if there's an advocacy thing, it might, maybe, what do we do?
Yeah.
You know, it's interesting you would bring that up, Kellyanne, because I don't know if you had a chance to watch the Every Library webinar series, but in every single one of them, the presenter said, it's the librarians that people vote for. It's not really the building or the books, it's you as librarians, which is kind of funny because I think they don't know what librarians do, but if your character is such that they see you as transformative, they'll vote for you. And I thought that was really interesting.
And you know, I was just talking about the survey that we did, this patron survey that we did, and it was like a 3-month survey. It was super intense and stuff. 90% of what came back is as one of the questions, like, what's the best thing about visiting the library? Well, yeah, you get your stuff, but they said my staff. They said the staff, they know what I want, they interact with me. You know, sometimes that's the only touch point I have for social, you know, during the day. And I just think that, you know, highlighting that, you know, we are people in the building, in the library, who are doing, you know, really good work, then, you know, that could just be a different approach.
And there is clearly a lot of agreement with you on the chat. I'm just gonna, so Carly added, I think also understanding of the scope of what we know and can use and the work we do. Pamela also said this is crucial, the human connection is so important. Dana said school librarians are facing the same crooked assumptions, and that's why we are being assigned coding classes, study halls, virtual high school students, title reading class. All of this undermines the time available to keep the doors open for all students. And Pamela said, this is especially important as artificial intelligence and algorithms become the norm. So I'm going to mark down, as you can, those of you who are online can actually see what I'm doing. The people in the room can't because we don't have a display. So I'm taking notes as people talk so we can refer back. And I'm just going to make a note that there was strong agreement that we need to focus on the human connection. Oh, you can't see my screen? Oh. Do I need to? Can others see? Because it shows that. I'll just try stopping it and restarting it. Ah, well, thank you for letting me know. Let's see, that works. Now can you see it?
Yes.
All right. Okay.
So what I've heard in the last 15 minutes is talk about libraries as non-essential service, get loud, humanize librarians. So these sounds like good pieces to pass on to this advocacy group that we're getting closer to being able to hire.
Yep.
So that's really useful. That's really helpful.
Yeah.
Are there any other things along that line that Jenny can hear to help start this next process?
And keep in mind that we will have similarly a steering committee. Lots of opportunity for work for people to help guide that process as it moves forward.
So is there any way that we document, or you have a documentation from us, of all the different programs that we offer that are not like library connected? Like we have the health department here, doing workshops all the time, So is there any way we are getting credit for all those outside things we're providing for our community, that there's actually a listing somewhere? Like we do the money project that the college offers. We do, social services come in. We have Alzheimer's meetings here.
That's a great question, Sonia.
Is there any way to let the public know of the things that we do that are not just library? Because I know we all do them. I just don't think we take credit for them because we just host them.
Point. And Tracy and I have had conversations about putting up some kind of, even if it's just some Google Forms, to help you track those kinds of things that we can then use to communicate. And maybe this advocacy campaign can help us pull together some of that kind of reporting functionality as well.
Well, at the South Central Federation meeting this last weekend, there was a lot of talk about individual libraries' partnerships with these other non-traditional library sort of services. And I can see not only would it be good for helping to have this would not only be good for the state library in terms of advocacy work, but it might be useful for individual libraries looking at how their fellow libraries have found partners to help them basically promulgate, to push forward kind of library goals.
Yeah, because like right now we host for the tax season, we host the AAR people here who provide tax service. And I know there's nowhere we get credit, and we don't necessarily want credit, but somehow that needs to come across when you're discussing libraries, that these are the things that we are able to provide for our community.
And even just anecdotally, shoot us emails with that information. We're certainly collecting it, but we'll figure out a way to capture that.
Have a list of partners. Mm-hmm. That would be actually very useful.
I think it'd be useful for a number of reasons. As you said, Sonia, it almost becomes the seed for that kind of coalition work that goes on.
So Pamela says, as the government recedes from social services, libraries need to not only host these agencies, but to truly partner with them and then talk about it.
Yeah.
Any other questions or comments or thoughts? Okay, and if you think of something like Jenny said, just email us and let us know. I've been certainly trying to take notes. I think this is definitely going to be useful for whoever is selected to do the public awareness campaign as well. So unless anyone has kind of a final call, I'm going to move on to the next agenda item, which is the stakeholder analysis of usage of LDD services. And it looks like almost all of you have. I'm just going to pull up the map of the usage of our services. So we'll just.
So sorry, now I realize that I said library strategies, but that has not been,
right.
The campaign person has not been determined yet.
Yes.
Okay.
So
sorry about that.
On the agenda, it's on the map. If you don't mind sharing, Sarah, do you, Joanne?
Not at all.
All right.
Thank you.
So what I did is this is as part of that data-driven implementation model that those of you who've been on the NAC for a while, we had a training from Samantha Becker, and then Carol Orban and I attended the Research Institute for Public Libraries. And I would say one of the most interesting things for me about learning that is not just that we think about impact or outcome, but that it's starting to frame my questions. And so I wanted to know who's using library development services and who's not. And I wanted to look at it on a community basis, statewide. I wanted to know, were there any gaps? Were there any places we weren't reaching? And why? And so this map is the total of all of the 8 services that were in the memo that I listed for you. Continuing education, shared catalog, Montana Libraries to Go, OCLC, consulting services, and so forth. The larger the circle, the more library development services that community uses. This was definitely just a zeros and ones, and it was if one library in that community used a library development service, I gave it a 1. So it's not even showing all the libraries in all the communities that use the service. What I discovered was that I didn't really see any gaps in our usage. There are some, like our newer projects, like the Montana Memory Project and the Courier, that aren't as widely used as like OCLC or the Montana Shared Catalog and so forth. But it was really kind of cool, actually. I didn't really know what I was going to find out. What I found out is that almost all of our services are really heavily used.
You talk about green?
Green, so green means that that county does not have a legal public library. Okay? Those 2 counties, Golden Valley and Treasure, actually do contract with nearby libraries, and South Central actually does provide services they usually invest that funding into Montana Library to Go. So those 2 counties, that's the significance of why they are green and why their dots are smaller. So the smaller the dot, the fewer number of services they use. And this is all types of libraries, not just publics. So what we did next after we went through this is I met with each of the staff members who were kind of responsible for that service, and we talked about why certain libraries might not be using our services. And that's what I was getting at with the memo that I sent to the NAC. So for those of you that are in the room, if you want to click on the memo, head back to the agenda and then click on the memo. I listed sort of the reasons that we came up with for why the services aren't used. And I wanted to ask the NAC, as kind of a multi-type, all sizes, all geographic location council, are there other reasons why certain stakeholders might not use particular services, and or do you agree with this list, or what other input would you like to share with me, or what questions does this generate for you?
Initial thought I have is that if this were turned into a survey, you could take your 8 services.
Mm-hmm.
Do you use them, or do you use this or not? If not, select one or more of these, or fill in the blank, and get a more sort of a granular look at this information. If librarians were willing to spend probably wouldn't take very long to fill it out.
Mm-hmm.
Might give you a more granular view of this.
I wonder if you could add one other thing to that. The variety of reasons is that I didn't really see anything in there about a lack of understanding about that service.
Oh.
Or a lack of training.
That's a really good
So they might not be using the service because they don't know enough about it.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I'll just scan online. I'm again taking minutes. What is meant by philosophical differences? The best example I can think of is taking the shared catalog. Some libraries feel strongly that they'd rather have like an open source software because they think they don't want to be locked into a vendor. So that's a concrete example of that. Let me just see if I missed anything else. Any other thoughts on this? Was this useful to see? Share with you?
Would it change the state library's behavior in terms of what it did for library development if you had better understanding of this?
You know, I think so in the sense that I guess for us when we did the stakeholder analysis, it was like we kind of ended up coming to the conclusion that some libraries were just not in a place where they were going to use a particular service. Well, why was that? And was that because of a local challenge, in which case the local challenges are our consulting services. They can help with that if that library is interested in being helped in that way. And they may not be. That might not be where they're at. And if it's not a local challenge, then what else is going on? Is it because it's cost prohibitive? Well, okay, that is maybe something we can use to argue for more funding so that libraries can participate. So,
or change the pricing structure.
Or if it's a lack of knowledge, like Joe said, more concerted training effort or an evaluation of our training that might make whatever the service is more understandable, more accessible.
Do we have people and time to pursue this?
To go down deep with the survey? Well, we know which libraries are or aren't using our services. We could actually reach out to those libraries directly.
Yeah.
The other thing I thought would be interesting is to see it over time.
Yeah.
And to see if it's the same libraries that aren't using a particular service and to ask them why that might be if they felt comfortable sharing that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I don't think it would be too different.
Yeah. The other interesting little thing I think came out of this is I think that it gives myself and Jenny a way of showing that the state library does provide services statewide. It's not just urban. I was mainly looking for gaps, but what I really found was
not so much gaps.
Yeah. What I really found is we are used, and I think we can argue that cause. Any other thoughts on this? Okay.
One of the logical extensions of this would be if in the future we were hit with a situation where we had less money, or hit with a situation where we had more money, this might provide the start point for deciding what we do next, what services we drop or curtail, or what services we pursue and add. And it would be, I know that we've had that problem in the past and got around it by advice from the NAC, but this would give kind of a head start for the NAC for being able to provide that kind of advice. And I think the Commission would find that very useful, especially if we had to act quickly.
We're going to do some sort of a similar exercise at MLA, another plug, for one of our sessions. It's about E-rate, but it's not scary E-rate. It's just these kinds of questions. We want to understand from participants what the perceived barriers are that prevent libraries from making use of E-rate so that we can respond appropriately, use our resources to respond appropriately. And it's going to be fun and action-oriented and drink coffee because you're going to have to move.
So when is that session?
It's Saturday morning, I think it's like 8:30.
Yeah.
And then the other thought I had on this in terms of using this information is, whatever nonprofit we work towards or whatever funding stream, that map, when you look at the individual services broken out, it could help you say, if you would give us funding for OCLC, this is how many communities in Montana would benefit from that versus other projects that we do. So it's useful for that as well. Okay, so we'll move to the next item on the agenda, which is our success indicators. If you look at the LDD work plan, I put this in here actually because I wanted to be accountable to the NAC. It's really important to me that the LSTA plan and our strategic framework don't just sit on a shelf and gather dust, and we come to the end of it and we're like, oh, look, we somehow luckily managed to do that. A lot of people put a huge amount of work into that product, and so I want you to see what we've been doing. I'm using the LSTA plan because, of course, that's what we report back to the Institute of Museum and Library Services. This is primarily for your information, but I wanted to talk about the Develop a Centralized Acquisitions Pilot Project. So this project came about because Missoula is looking at going into pre-processing, and we realized in helping a couple of other libraries go through that process that it's incredibly labor-intensive and time-intensive for shared catalog staff, and that using within CERC Dynex different standards actually causes conflicts within the system, which causes problems for patrons. And so we reached out to shared catalog libraries and kind of said, we know this is a problem, and we know we're going to need to have standards. Will you help us? And so libraries just volunteered, knowing that they were kind of signing up to possibly make changes to their home locations and so forth in their categories. And so that group, we worked with them over the course of several months. We interviewed them to ask how patrons find items, how they categorize items, how they decide funding, all of those kinds of things, how they use statistics. And then we came back with a recommendation for the group, and we said we could go 3 paths. We could actually choose to be radical and maybe explore like genreification or something like that. We could choose a middle path where we reduce the number of home locations and we all agree on what those home locations are called, which is somewhat similar to the reorg work that the Montana Shared Catalog did a few years ago. Or we could choose to say to libraries, if you want to have customization, you'll have to pay for it, although that led to complications. The group agreed to go with the middle path, and so Gemma has developed a timeline and is going to come back with recommendations to the group to reduce the number of home locations and to try and have standardization for that group. There were group members who were very interested in the radical path, actually, and Gemma thought that they could pursue that if they wanted to, even with just the reduction in home locations. There were ways to do that. So that work will be happening, and once it happens, the group then will review it. We'll work through it, come to a recommendation for the standards, and those changes can be made. And any libraries wanting to use acquisitions module within the shared catalog would need to use those home locations, unless they're being totally independent. But if they use any kind of vendor, like Baker, Taylor, or Ingram, they would need to use those standards. So that's actually it's partially to be more efficient with time. The workload on the shared catalog staff is it's pretty intense, even now that they have all 4 staff members. They really have more work than they can ever do. And so by being more standardized across the shared catalog, it can really free up their time, which will help get them to a better workload and also be more responsive when librarians want to adopt new technologies or new software. The other thing that's really important for me is I want the shared catalog to be in a position where it can move with technological changes. Otherwise, we'll die. I want it to be a choice that we stay with CERC Dynex, not that we're forced to because that's the only option, for instance. And that's the other reason why this project was, for me, much bigger than just the little piece that's acquisitions, because actually not many libraries use acquisitions within the shared catalog. It was it was part of positioning the shared catalog to be able to survive and move through changes with a lot more grace, quite frankly. Out of that project, there were a few libraries who were really interested in cooperative collection development. Gemma did an analysis of all of the libraries within that project and the items that they purchased, and found they select a lot of the same items, and they're all paying different prices. And we have libraries within that project that are in the sharing groups like partners, and they know that they're purchasing things for their local community, which is a great thing, but they're like, how does this fit with the fact that we're also sharing items with other libraries, and how do we handle that? And so that's what I was referring to earlier, the Cooperative Collection Development Project. It's just libraries opting in. I mean, it's so new, I don't even know exactly what will come out of it. We're literally going to have to kind of roll up the sleeves, try to figure this out meeting at the end of March to just see what would that look like. We do have examples. We have Montana Library To Go that I mentioned earlier, which is cooperative collection development. We have Wyoming, which negotiated contracts, so everybody pays the same standard price. I mean, there are some examples out there. So we're not creating anything new. So I wanted to report on that item. Did you have any questions for me or comments?
Well, we're using the Montana School digital shared libraries, also using that.
Mm-hmm. How's it working?
It's complicated. It is, and you know, but it's been a year, so but we use the model like the NAC, where we have a representation on that committee, which we labeled as our selection committee. We have a representation of all library types. So we have a K-12 library, we have K-5, 6-8, 5-12. So we have a representation of all library types, and we have a standard calendar, we have a standard procedure. One of our biggest challenges is that we don't have a governing policies. So because school districts are governed by their board of trustees, each school district is going to have a different selection or collection development policy. So that has limited some of our ability for selection.
Do you have a shared pool for your collection budget?
We do.
You do?
Yeah. We have a shared pool, and we try to do our, you know, we project our spending based on that pool. So we have so many K-5 libraries that are contributing to that funding, so they allocate that much of the resources. So it's been interesting, and in a year's time, I think we've made some progress. So.
What, do you have any online tools that you're able to use to help manage that?
Well, Overdrive has been really great to us. They have, Overdrive has placed, they have their collection specialist, a content specialist is what they call them. So they create the lists for us, and then they share it on a spreadsheet. But no, there isn't really any online tool, other than we use a lot of email communication. We do some conference calling and that sort of thing.
Thank you. That's helpful, especially the collection development policy challenge. Yes, something to think about.
Yes.
You know, I think the great conversation we had this morning around WISE, again, WISE is just a tool, but it can help facilitate these kinds of processes and really help us make the most of all the resources that we have, whether it's staff, whether it's collection budgets, whether it's space within our libraries, whether we're, you know, making the most of the courier and other kinds of services. It's a really critical conversation to the next evolution in collaboration and resource sharing in the state. So we're really, really excited about this opportunity.
Mm-hmm. Were there any questions in general on the LGD work plan? Anything you wanted me to go into more detail or talk about? I am happy to report that we do have a signed offer letter from Amelia Kim. She will be our new lifelong learning librarian. She is in library school right now, and so she won't be able to start until after library school, so she'll be starting in June. But I have to say, she's such a go-getter. I almost have to kind of say, Amelia, you don't work for us yet. Because she's like, can I talk to the former lifelong learning librarian? Can you send me what I'm going to be working on? So I think she's really excited to be starting. That's all I could think of, but if there is, yes, you did get that right, Carly. Her name is Amelia Kemp. Any other questions from me or anything on here? You were like, what does this mean? So I'm going to head back to the agenda and go to the memo to prepare for our discussion. And Jenny kind of laid the groundwork for this success indicators in that she talked about it in terms of the health of the state library. We sort of started this discussion. So last, at your August retreat, I had you kind of tell me about the impacts and what that looks like if we're successful. And as I was trying to pull all of this together and make sense of it and figure out how we were going to collect the data and go forward, I realized that I actually needed you to do that for the outcomes. I needed more granularity. Kara Orban and I are working on a massive spreadsheet that has this all laid out and all the data points and how we will need it, but there were clearly gaps. And so I'd like the NAC's help in identifying those gaps. And I'm hoping we can do this, even though the majority of you are online. But what I'd like to know is, if you scroll down the first to the second page, as we work on the objectives that you listed for us, which I listed above, I had two questions for you. And one of them is the true fact that an LSTA evaluator is going to ask members of the Network Advisory Council and state library staff, do you think you achieved these goals and outcomes? And so my question for you is, what would have to happen for you to say yes? What would you see? I mean, what do you see when you think about that outcome? What would that look like for libraries in Montana? And then the next question actually has to do with evaluating how we're doing along the way. What data and or information do you want to know about these outcomes and the success indicators? That's going to help you understand how we are doing. So while you're thinking and getting ready, I'm going to go ahead and copy these outcomes into the success indicator document that I started, and we'll take each outcome one at a time and talk about what you need to know about that to know whether or not we're achieving it, and what you would need to see in order to say, yes, the state library achieved that outcome. Okay. So the first outcome that we have is libraries participating in collaborative efforts report improved library services for their community and provide better collections for their patrons. What would you need to see in order to be able to say yes to the LSTA evaluator? This happened. We achieved it.
Can you clarify which document we're looking at?
So
Goal one, bold one.
Yeah. So we're looking at the memo for the discussion underneath the. Yes, that's the
This
one.
one?
Yep.
Oh, that's okay.
So two questions.
Yeah, go for it.
What's improved and what's better?
That's my question for the NAC. Anyone have any thoughts? What does improved mean to you? So Carly says higher CERC, higher attendance, and personal stories. And Dana says yes and no. So what do you think, Dana? What does improved mean?
Seems to me it can only be defined by whether it benefits patrons. And it has to come from the patrons. If in some ways the patron is better off, there's been a positive change. Either the collection is better from the patron's point of view, they're better off because something happened to the collection, or they're better off because something happened to the services.
Right.
It's like that old definition of information. Any difference makes a difference. And it seems like that's somehow related to this, that improved library services are only actually improved if they make a positive difference to patrons. And what would those positive differences be? So that...
Yes. So Elizabeth said increased search stats, in particular of shared collection materials.
So how did those shared materials transform readers' lives?
What do others think of? There's a whole bunch of chat that's been flying by, so.
Yeah, sorry.
So Dana was talking about the loss of Homework Montana and how that led to the creation of the consortium that Joanne was talking about earlier. And she says we are now talking about how to create consortiums for other services like a statewide database to for schools. And Carly says in response to Elizabeth, is it like the collection turnover rate? So what do people think of what Bruce is saying about success is really about the patron? The so what? Yes, you agree, disagree? Does that mean improved to you? Okay. So we have some more chat here. So Pamela says, staff is able to devote more time to local needs and patrons because of knowledge or services that have been shared or provided by another library, librarian, and MSL, etc. People think of that.
Well, it sounds like the end result is the patron's experience also. If they're able to devote more time to their patrons.
Carly says, measuring quality of life, she's talking about your point, Bruce, that is tough. Like the phrase from this morning, meaningful moments. What does that mean?
I agree. I think it's really hard. I mean, I was thinking about, as a patron, if I go into a library and check out a book and read it, and yet I am unchanged in every possible way, then there was really no benefit to me for having that book. But if it in some ways amused me or educated me or helped me think differently about my situation in life, or one of the 10 million ways that people respond to reading and learning, then that was a difference. The trick is just what Carly said, how do you measure that? But I think if we could figure out ways of measuring that, we would have an amazingly powerful way to talk about what we do and to do a better job of allocating our resources and planning for what we do. And I think that's the whole point of trying to understand this stuff, is to get better. So, as a patron, my use of library materials, my use of library services, how did that change me?
don't think we're ready to talk about it at this meeting, but you've heard me talk before about COSLA, the Chief Officers of State Library Agencies have an effort underway called Measures That Matter that get exactly to the point that Bruce is making. You know, how do we go about measuring these meaningful moments? And the effort started with a huge environmental scan of all of the different kinds of data elements that are collected about library services. And then from there, the steering committee has developed an action plan to help move forward the development of different kinds of metrics that are more impact-based, not output-based. And that action plan is just in draft at this point. They hope it will be finalized here in the next few weeks. And then a next round of funding to come from IMLS. This is a grant-funded effort that COSLA is working on. And so I think, you know, it's really exciting to know that this is sort of a national conversation that's happening where we can all be thinking across the country about how we tell these stories and collect this kind of data. I also think it's a bit of a relief to realize we don't have to figure this out for ourselves.
Good.
But I think having these kinds of conversations now will position us well to be able to take advantage of new and different kinds of metrics in the future.
You know, in the past, we looked at measures like we've discussed, like how many books get circulated, or how many books from a certain part of our collection get circulated, or how many reference interactions we have, and that's all good, and I think that those are really useful numbers, but they don't really get to the bone of things, and they don't, you know. So we circulated more books, so what? I mean, so they were read by more patrons, so what? More patrons had a chance to, you know, it doesn't really, until you get to that point where you can say, and I read this book and I was changed this way. It made me into a homicidal maniac. It made me into a saint. I mean, that's, you know, those are. I mean, I'm being silly, but those are the kind of things I wish that we could get at. It hurts my head to think about it. I think it's really hard. But once we can get there, we will be in a way better situation.
Well, I don't know that I'm not sure that it's as hard as we think. I mean, one of the interesting parts of the Research Institute for Public Library conference that we went to was the different ways you can collect data. And I mean, as simple as putting a question on a flip chart or a butcher paper in the library with little 3M sticky notes that just kind of would ask, you know, patrons questions like that. What change did you see when you read this book? Or what would it mean for you if the library went away? That might be a really powerful question that would get at some of the ways the library makes a difference for patrons. And I think we have done that. You know, the Montana Library Day, when we did that in September, and we just asked patrons, we got a lot of pretty heartwarming stories about the changes. And one of the things I find interesting is when Ripple talked about this, he said, it's not like you have to have every person's story. What it is you have the data that shows your circ and your usage, and then you say, and here's some individual stories of people who came in and how this made a difference for them. And the implication is, if it made a difference for those people, those 4 or 5 people, it might have made a difference for the 1,000 people that walk through your doors.
That's a good point.
And so it makes it much more manageable. I'm going to come back. Some other comments that came in the what does improved mean in this outcome. Elizabeth says, users have greater awareness about provenance of materials from shared collections across the state. So Elizabeth, do you just mean greater awareness of the service? Oh, in other words, they actually delight in knowing that a book has come all the way from Miles City to fill their reading need.
Another part of what Elizabeth says, it also makes people aware that we do have a unified space.
Yeah. Okay.
And that they value it.
Pamela Pamela said it would likely be subtle for patrons as some of the improvements and changes will be happening with the staff. Carly says, I think we can measure the responsiveness of library services, like what did we change and how did we make decisions based on patron values? So for you, let me just scroll down, Carly, because I may have missed a follow-up, but it sounds to me like on this one you're saying that, and maybe we might need some more clarification what you mean by measure the responsiveness of library services and what did we change and how did we make decisions. If you could clarify, that would be helpful for me. I'll confess, I spent the last about 10 days in a car with Pam driving about 1,200 miles, so I'm a little slow, even though I did have extra coffee. Pamela says, I think Elizabeth has a good point. Patrons have more of an awareness of the expanded resources or services they have access to, albeit via their local library.
A lot of these kinds of things have a sort of a faster, better, cheaper component. And so, improved or quality may be tied to some combination of those things. I get my materials faster. I'm getting better materials. It's costing me less to do what I need to do as an individual, as a business owner or as a quilter or something because I have these resources. Maybe that triangle that instead of thinking out of 3, maybe we can use those as data points for determining quality. That has the advantage is lots of people are familiar with those metrics and it's easier for us to talk about them.
Pamela says patrons should feel empowered because of the increased resources at their fingertips, no barriers. Instead of, oh, my local library doesn't have, but that's okay because I have access to content from the whole state. So that's kind of patrons have access to more stuff. It's a very non-techie way of saying that.
I think that's good.
As few barriers as possible. And Carly said, I think helping people understand that we are public servants who take them seriously and value them. We want to serve them. If they want cake pans, we'll get them cake pans. How do we adapt and adjust what we do in order to meet their needs and help them? Just something we can control and we can count, and that I think people appreciate about us. So improved service to you, Carly, is that the librarians are responsive to patron requests and deliver on those services.
And you can take apart the word responsive, and that has to do with speed and with the how close it came to responding to what the patron wanted, what was the quality of the response. So you can unpack the word responsive.
Yes, that's why I asked Carly to clarify that, because I was thinking responsive was speed. Mary Kay's example, it takes 4 or 5 weeks. Well, I would say her patrons are getting improved service if we can move that to a few days. Yeah. Any other things, going back to the outcome, libraries participating in collaborative efforts report improved library services for their community and provide better collections for their patrons. What has to happen for you to say yes when the LSTA evaluator says, did the state library achieve this outcome?
You could rephrase the second bullet: library directors and staff demonstrate knowledge, skills, and desire to, did it happen, and how successful. Or I withdraw the word successful into what, I don't know how you say it, but you could actually look at evidence. You could look at the number and nature of collaborative activities. You could take a behavioralist approach to that, not a Jungian.
So did collaborative efforts happen? What else did you say, Bruce? Sorry, I was copying the next outcome.
But just, yeah, I mean, you know, what is participation, collaborative participation look like? If you unpack the word participate, then you probably get some behaviors, and you could just see the degree to which library directors and staff behave that way.
I think this particular point gets back to your mapped data, Tracy, and some of the desire to do more surveys around why libraries currently are not participating.
This would almost be a quantitative evaluation point.
I wanted to go back to the first bullet just really quickly. I think it's important to acknowledge that it's not always about doing more. Sometimes it's about doing different if that different becomes more of a priority. Being responsive to certain challenges as they arise in our communities. So, you know, to me that's two things, that librarians have the ability to identify those needs and either the resources necessary to respond or the ability to prioritize their work in such a way that they make the resources available.
We kind of saw that in the Ys, where they reduce the size of their collection and increase circulation.
Mm-hmm. Carly says, yes, we cannot keep doing more for the sake of more. We have to be strategic and purposeful, he said. Pamela says, perhaps specifically in the case of technology, a library and its patrons realize more advanced services or products because of a relationship with another library that has the ability or training to provide a shared service program or technology.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, getting to that collaboration then. Mm-hmm.
Elizabeth says, established policies and procedures are clear, simple, and standardized. They are followed by those engaged in collaborative activities. Just to clarify, Elizabeth, is that for the first outcome, or is that for the outcome about knowledge, skills, and desire to participate in collaborative efforts, or both? Second outcome. Okay, that's what I thought. So I think Elizabeth is saying that probably a behavior or something that you see are standardized, established policies and procedures, and then engagement.
That sentence might benefit from an Oxford comma. Knowledge, comma, skills, comma.
Oh, yeah. You can copy and paste from various PDFs. Insert commas and spellings as needed. Any other thoughts on these first two? Participating in collaborative efforts, reporting improved library services, or demonstrating the knowledge, comma, skills, comma, and desire to participate in collaborative efforts? Okay, I'm going to paste the third outcome. Libraries participating in collaborative efforts are more efficient. The effort saves staff time and improves workflow.
I think Jenny's point fits well with this too, that there's an added flexibility to change services to meet the needs of the community or patrons. That seems efficiency to me.
It seems like effectiveness.
Yeah, yes.
As well as Pamela's point about benefiting from our neighboring shared resources and expertise.
So more efficient is more stuff and services to patrons for less effort or less resources, less overall resource costs. Is that correct? So you could make that a numeric thing. Saves staff time, that's probably numeric. Improves workflows is a slightly slipperier one. How do you know you have an improved workflow?
There's at least some metrics like time to get materials on the shelf and available.
Kind of time motion.
Yeah, that's one thing that comes to my mind.
Number of steps involved.
Yeah, this whole pre-processing and acquisitions pilot is right up that alley.
But do we have the flexibility for these bullet points to simplify them at this point, or this is what we have? This is what we're stuck with?
That would be a Kara question. My sense is it's challenging, but I think if we had enough changes we wanted to make, we could probably do that if they become
I wonder if it might make this whole process simpler if each one of these asks one simple question that could be answered. Because they're really asking multiple questions, not all of which are easily and unambiguously answered. And your task, your staff's task, might be simplified, and you might be able to get better cooperation from Montana libraries if these were more discrete questions.
That's a good point. Make note of that, and I'll ask Kara what she thinks. That might be too much of a substantive change.
It's like you said, it's all about asking the right question.
Right.
And these are maybe not, there's nothing wrong with what you're asking about, but they're not, to me, the clearest way of asking the question.
Joe Flick just provided a good webinar, 3-part webinar, surveys and questionnaires. That was
Exactly.
You know, yeah, it was great. Just
the fact that I'm starting to see that is slightly encouraging. Just
slightly
slightly good.
The other thing I just want to bring up here is, I think, an interesting point that another librarian made is a kind of cautionary note on saying more efficient, save money.
Mm-hmm.
Because when you say it that way, and I see nodding heads, so I think you know where I'm going. I can't see you online, but you might be nodding your heads too. Is that funders think, oh, well, we can cut the library staff and budget because you're more efficient and you've saved money. And I thought that was a really great point. And I don't think libraries have enough money for us to be going down that road. And I'd just be curious to hear the NAC's thoughts on that. Would you agree that that is a concern to have? And I would say mainly that just we need to be very cautious about the way we phrase these things.
The larger issue is, given X amount of resources coming into the library, the positive outcomes for patrons is increased. I mean, it's resources in patron effect. I mean, that's what you're trying to take and evaluate. Not whether you're using more or less money or doing more or fewer things, it's whether the patron's lot is improved in some way. Unless we're just doing this because we're amused doing librarian-like things, which is a fairly silly way to spend time.
Yeah. Well, I suspect in our public awareness campaign that someone will be able to help us articulate that in an effective way, because I think Tracy's exactly right.
So Carly said better allocation of and ability to leverage funding instead of save.
Mm-hmm.
And Pamela says cost avoidance versus savings. Saving money. I think, for me, the things that I just sort of had an aha moment during the WISE presentation was when he said, that the Allen County public library realized how many dollars they were spending on dead items, meaning they sat on the shelf and they never moved. And I was like, oh, yeah, I mean, what librarian wants that to happen? We have limited budgets. You would like every dollar you spend on an item to result in movement. Because in theory, that means the patrons, something good is happening for the patrons. And maybe that's the way we word it. It's like, hey, we only have these dollars, but every single dollar is making a difference. It's benefiting the patron in some way. Because I think the other thing that, I guess what in theory that library would be able to show is that we have this same book budget, but now it's getting this usage because we're spending every dollar to benefit our patrons based on the data we are collecting. So maybe that's the way we could word it as well.
It's probably possible to quantify the cost of leaving a book unused on the shelf for a year. That's probably a number that you could figure out. And so if you have over a 2-year period, 10% of a collection of 100,000 books doesn't circulate, then you know that 10,000 times that cost is what that costs. You could actually put a number to it. That still doesn't get at the heart of things, which is what difference is this making? How is this transferring patrons? I hate to say this, but I cheated and I jumped ahead to goal 3 and look at the phrase "thrive in community." And boy, I have a pretty clear picture of what that is. Oh, wait a second, no, I don't. I mean, that's not a very clear. I don't know what that is. And I don't know how you measure it.
This is one where I feel like we want to put it back on the libraries to define that for themselves. I don't know that we at the state library want or need to have some kind of concrete definition, as long as each library, each community can define for themselves what, though, if it's some strategic goals within the community, if it's a particular issue that a community is facing that they're trying to address.
Is it happiness? Is it economic development? Is it educational attainment?
Right.
It's just when we roll it up with the mixture of different meanings, we don't really have anything that's really meaningful.
Do we know that?
But
or are we assuming that?
And is that important?
I don't know.
Or is the collection of stories what's important? I'm really compelled by the Drummond School Community Library and others too. Sonia, you mentioned the Alzheimer's meetings and how to, as a community, effectively provide services that address Alzheimer's needs. That's something that the Drummond community has taken on as a challenge that they know they need to address because no other services in the area are addressing it.
So that narrative is, hi, we're Drummond Public Library, school community library. This is a need in our community. This is how we're addressing it. I mean, that you need to kind of you need to sort of contextualize the story before you tell it.
Exactly. And while we might not be able to say we're seeing this much more efficiency in how we allocate our book budget, that's a metric, but you can then equate that savings to more resources that are available to provide that kind of service.
Or stories from caregivers, or stories from Alzheimer's people who are suffering with.
And when we had that presentation the first night that we did it, we actually had an author here with a book that she had written about her experience with her mother going through Alzheimer's. So we did the book first, and then a person from Alzheimer's follow-up. So it was kind of a twofold, using books and a community service together.
Yeah, I think that the story, and that's actually what I love about local libraries, the story looks different in every community. There are themes. There are themes from schools to publics of what they're doing for kids, and how they're helping them, and how they're helping them navigate through some pretty challenging social issues. When I talked to Sarah about some of the patrons she has at the law library, she could sit down and talk to some of her public library director peers, and they would have very similar conversations about the social challenges they're dealing with. And so what I guess I'm trying to say is I think themes will emerge. What will make it powerful are the individual stories of what that looks like in communities around Montana. And that you can show that at a statewide basis, but how powerful it is for Sonia to tell that to her representatives about this is what that looks like in Miles City, and Jody can tell her representatives this is what this looks like in Drummond.
So I would assume that Sonia might change what she does in her library based upon those stories. In which case, the story has enough power to be worth, that's a measurement. If the story changes Sonia's behavior, then that was a valuable story. Sorry to pick on you, Sonia.
I don't mind. The other thing that I was thinking is the more that we let people know what's going on in our libraries, like a lot of times I learn new ideas of what to try in my library just from hearing the stories. You know, that's a very valuable tool. It's finding out how something did or didn't work in another library. I think that collaboration between all of us is always very helpful.
You're basing your work on models that have been successful and, you know, potentially not implementing something that hasn't been successful. Or learning from it to make it more successful.
Elizabeth had a comment here. She said a success indicator for her on this one is recognition that the library matters in the media. It would be nice if when a community issue arose, one of the first questions asked locally is, what does the library director think about this? And Carly says, or maybe what resources can the library offer? Sonia, I don't know if you can see chat, but Carly, we love you. And Elizabeth says, a measurable outcome is how many times have libraries or library events been mentioned in a Montana publication for the media.
Maybe we need to connect with the Best of Times supplement that goes in the newspapers and do an article on our libraries, like from a state perspective of our big system.
I'm going to put that under the budget discussion idea, even though that's not, I know it's not really about money, but I think what you're talking about is what Bruce is talking about. If we can show the value that we deliver, money can follow.
As I look at this stuff, you know, this is not the first time I've seen these things. Obviously, the outcome, the goals and outcomes, but you know, I'm really unhappy with them now, and that I'm not suggesting anything.
Okay.
But what it tells me is that my thinking has changed in the time since, in less than a year since we started talking about this stuff. I'm thinking more about what can be measured, what can be known, what is useful information.
Can we measure this? Will you document that? I mean,
this now just kind of frustrates me, and before it kind of looked good. These are all things that we thought were valuable. Even though I look at them now and I say, I don't know what any of this is really. It's not clean enough. I think it's Tracy's fault for this stupid SODAT process. It's really got me thinking differently. And I just think about what better information IMLS would have if in our evaluation we had more discrete measurement kinds of things. We'd be a better partner for them.
No, I had the same thing happen to me, Bruce. The It's like,
Did you?
as I was starting to try and make this plan a reality, I was like,
I'm so
oh,
sorry.
I would so word that differently.
Yeah.
But my hands are somewhat tied.
No, I get that. I
And
get
so
that.
that's what I think I'm trying to do with the NAC, is like get that clarity so that at least we all know. This is what
Right.
that means.
Right. And that's what I meant too about positioning ourselves so that as the measures that matter effort develops, you know, I think we are leaps and bounds ahead of other states because we're already thinking in this way. We're learning. You know, the process you describe is just an evolution in our learning, and that's great.
So I used to like McDonald's Big Macs, and then yesterday I had a hamburger at a restaurant in Wilsall that was the best cheeseburger I've had in a decade. That's the difference. That's the difference. This is McDonald's, but we know about this amazing burger we can get in Wilsall. We can do better.
Yeah, I would agree. And even though I'm sort of frustrated because of the practical aspect of working with this, I'm okay with it because, you know, when Samantha Becker was talking, my mind was blown. And I knew that she was talking about stuff that I was not going to get overnight. My brain just doesn't work that way. Well, for one thing, I'm an abstract thinker anyway, and an idealist. So that's a pretty dangerous combo to be writing a black and white strategic plan, let me tell you. But that's okay, we're learning and we're getting through this. And with the NAC's help, I can kind of drill down and I can get more specific so that we're all sort of on the same page.
And what you said, I think, is really important. Let's conduct our business closer to the bone than what this says. We know we have to do this to keep IMLS happy, and that's all great. But as we do planning and make decisions about how we're going to allocate resources, let's do it based upon more concrete, discrete data points.
Yes.
And just to add to that, you know, the plan should guide our work. It should guide our resource allocation. And so, you know, these are the kinds of things that we want to go back to staff and say, from a library development perspective, what do we do that will have these kinds of outcomes that will yield these kinds of impacts? And for the members of the NAC, you know, where there are roles for you to either communicate and or help us gather this kind of data, that becomes your responsibility and opportunity as members of the NAC to help us in that process.
And I would throw this out there. The other thing I have learned in this process is to truly measure these data points takes more time than you would realize. So less is more.
Mm-hmm.
So that is something to keep in mind.
Absolutely. Particularly with fewer staff resources.
Yes. Yes, that is our reality.
So one thing that'll be interesting, I was struck a little bit by the concrete data points, because the current data points that we provide to IMLS, they really couldn't be more concrete. The number of starts, the number of visitors, the number of public access computers we have, the size of our staff, the size of our budget, they're as concrete as you could get, but they're not
meaningful.
They're not meaningful. They don't measure impact. So we're in this tension right now between trying to demonstrate that impact and moving away from something that's very concrete, but trying to keep that the data collection process manageable. And it'll be really interesting to know if tools like WISE in the future help us to measure those kinds of metrics and how they help us in that way. You know, the tools we have right now are wonderful at measuring the current metrics that we report. So maybe in the future, some of those tools will help us measure these other kinds of needs.
It'd be interesting to know if there were similar discussions going on at OCLC or Triple I or fill in the blank.
Well, I know that Scott, the gentleman I mentioned earlier, loves data, and he's fascinated by the measures that matter.
He's been a part of the Measures That Matter
That's good.
Yeah.
steering group.
So for those of you that are online, I thought I'd just check in. Is there anything else you would like to add to this outcome, which is the library directors, etc., listen, engage, and lead to promote a thriving community? And while you are all thinking, I will copy the next one, which is about librarians, advisory members, and board members increase their knowledge about library trends and balancing digital and traditional library services.
I think that's a great one to drop.
Okay, so funny you should say that.
Yeah, I mean, because increase your knowledge doesn't mean a darn thing.
It's actually very concrete, though.
Well, kind of, but what action results from that?
That's actually the next outcome. So one of the things that Samantha Becker talked about was creating short-term, intermediate, and long-term outcomes. And your short-term outcome is did an increase in knowledge happen? And you do that so that you can show progress on the continuum, and probably so that you don't get completely discouraged. Because you can kind of measure an increase in knowledge, but you can't immediately measure whether or not action happened as a result of that knowledge. That's a long-term outcome. So it shows it's a continuum. You're seeing these outcomes, we pulled these out. They're not necessarily next to their long-term outcomes, but they are in the 5-year plan. So that's. This one's actually fairly concrete, kind of to measure. We could just ask librarians and trustees, did you have an increase in knowledge?
Could you?
Actually, yes, you can. But they could lie.
Well, I was about to say, what does their answer mean?
Their answer means that they have identified that they think they have an increase in knowledge about library trends.
That's what I think. Or not.
Or not.
Would it have the same meaning to take out about library trends? Just increase knowledge about balancing digital and traditional library services? I like to take words out.
No, I'm okay with that.
Yeah, I like that better.
Yeah, I do too.
More to the point, librarians, advisory members, and board members have an evolving sense of the balance of digital and traditional library service. Their understanding has changed, has evolved.
Okay.
Is that doing you disservice, sir?
No, does it make it longer?
Yeah, well, it certainly needs to
Talking
be.
about the measure.
Yeah.
It seemed to me that the real question was an evolving understanding of the balance of, and
Yes.
getting at that at the heart of, that was the heart of the matter.
Keeping up to date, basically, is what this is about.
Well, on a practical level, maybe they're spending, that's something you can measure. Yeah, I'm spending money differently in terms of paper versus E.
Mm-hmm.
E versus P is different.
So I want to clarify something, and I'd like to ask all the NAC members to weigh in. So you said that it was about keeping their knowledge up on trends. But actually, what I remember, and I don't know if Laura is still with us, I remember Laura saying, there's like all these expectations on us to do all this new stuff, yet we're still expected to maintain all of the traditional stuff. And so I thought this was about, in the long term, helping librarians and trustees figure out that sweet spot where they're maintaining the traditional services that are still heavily used, letting go of the ones that aren't, and dipping their toe into the next level of services. Is that not what you meant? Did you mean something different?
Oh, I remember that too. So that.
Yeah. So the chat is, Elizabeth says, for both this goal and the previous one, steady or increased attendance at MLA or any other library conference educational opportunity is a measurable indicator of knowledge and awareness endeavors of library professionals in Montana. And she asked, do we poll libraries in Montana about conference attendance throughout the year? Which
We kind of do,
We kind of do if they certify.
if they're certified, right? Exactly.
Yeah. And Carly asked, we would ask them to quantify their endeavors. Is that what you mean, Elizabeth? And Carly said, I think what Bruce said about value and balance is excellent and can be measured by asking them. And Elizabeth confirmed that Carly was correct. And Mary Kay said, is evolving more than keeping up to date, though?
I think that's a really good point, and that's what I was thinking about in my mind. You know, and it is, I think, a measure of knowledge and ability that they have the ability to measure the effectiveness of their current resource investment and the knowledge and ability to evolve how they're investing those resources.
I'm just thinking about academic libraries. It used to be they spent no money on electronic materials. And at one point they were probably spending, let's make this up, 10% on E, 90% on P, paper. And then now for most larger academic institutions are spending in excess of 90% on electronic materials and 10% on paper. Without attaching a value to that, that's something which you could describe quantitatively as an evolution of spending habits. And that would be, well, that's a data point. You can look at that and then say, but then you could ask that, you could say, I see that you have completely changed the way you spend money on materials. Now, 100% on E and 0% on P. Why have you done that? How do you know that your strategy was successful? It actually brings you to a point where you can start to approach then effect on patron.
Right.
Would that be a useful skill set or knowledge set for librarians and trustees to have? Is that what you were thinking, NAC members? It's like how to evaluate where you're going?
Well, we know of other libraries in the state that have changed the way they process materials, and they're spending more money on pre-processing to free up staff time for other activities. So that's actually that's a different bite out of the same apple.
Mm-hmm.
And I would hope that all libraries are remaining flexible and kind of evaluating how they're allocating resources to make sure that they're moving towards greater patron effect. Again, getting back to how do you tell if they're doing it or not.
Carly said she thought it would be very valuable for library decision makers. Carly said, yes, I think it would be very valuable for library decision makers to be able to kind of evaluate the value they're getting from traditional library services versus digital, and whether or not their strategy worked or didn't work.
Great, yeah.
Any other success indicators for this one? Anything that would make you go, yep, I can say we achieved that?
The last goal about mastering digital literacy skills. Can one ever truly master digital literacy skills?
That's a good question.
Pursue mastery. You can certainly measure that. Mastery is pretty absolute for kind of a non-absolute.
Master them well enough at the moment to teach and apply them is what Carly said.
Excellent. Good for Carly. She's right.
Not to put my school librarian on the spot, because Dana had to abandon you and leave.
Oh,
But
yeah.
do you have thoughts on this? Because to me, this is your area.
Well, I think it's measurable. I would agree with Bruce that I don't know that you master it. I think that there should always be a continuum.
Yeah.
And
There you go.
yeah,
There you go. You can measure that.
you can measure that. But I think as much as you learn literacy skills, you have to dump the ones that don't fit in the right spot too. So that's another thing that I know in my situation I constantly struggle with. It's great to know a lot of digital literacy skills, but you have to know the right one for the right task.
That's good.
It's like the NAC is a pencil and it's getting constantly sharper.
And
Yes.
built out.
So do I have any of my academic librarians still on? I was wondering if you would like to weigh in on this, because you also work in this area. I think I do. I still see Pamela and Hannah if you're still at your desks. Is there anything you would add to this? And while you are possibly typing, I will go ahead and grab the final outcome, which is about increasing, public libraries increasing their bandwidth in order to meet national standards. Pamela said not at the moment.
It seems to me this last one about bandwidth is easily measured. We know what they have now. We know what the standard is for their type of library. We know what the difference is between what they have and what they should have according to standard. We can see if there's a change in that. That's pretty straightforward. How it's implemented and stuff is a slightly different question. That would be given to stories. But as a numeric thing, that's easy enough to measure. It would be interesting to understand that using your math approach, Tracy. The
How many meet the national standard on the map?
If we find that the larger cities in Montana meet it and the rural don't, then that's something. If we find all the libraries in the Highline meet it in spades and none of the rest of us do, that says something else.
It's interesting. We have that data. Suzanne's working on refreshing it right now, but based on the 2016 statistics, it was what I found was it was a reflection of budget, but also a reflection of those libraries that had good relationships with their telecommunications providers. Kellyanne, are you still on? Kellyanne is one of the libraries who meet the standards. And do you still have a grant or someone who's providing that bandwidth for you?
She is still on.
The other one is Ronan.
Nope. I'm here. Ask me the question again, the full question again.
You're one of the handful of libraries who currently meet broadband standards for the size of your library. And I thought I recalled that you had either a grant or some kind of relationship with a provider where they provided that broadband at lower no.
Yes. So we have, it's kind of their way to get, it's called Lewistown Online is where we get our internet, and they do, we're just kind of an advertising we're like their little, goodwill project that they do. So we're just very lucky that way. We used to do the E-rate for the phones, but we don't do that anymore. But yeah, it's we do have a relationship with our provider.
There's another one where they have just a great provider that really wants to provide more bandwidth, and there's a handful of those kinds of smaller providers who see that as their role and way of supporting their community.
Carly said, I think it would also be worthwhile to compare library measures with their average community members' measures. We have an excellent connection compared to the average member of our community. Gives a sense of what the numbers mean. That's a very good point, Carly.
It is. That's really true, because the standards, as they are pretty broad. I hate to say arbitrary, but they're very broad.
That's a really good point.
I didn't know that on the map it will show that you have high-speed broadband if only one household in the block on the map has access.
In the census block?
Yeah. So even though, maybe I'm on a hill and I can get the standard, but my neighbors are slightly downhill and they can't, our neighborhood is considered to be able to meet the standard because I can get the higher speed bandwidth. And I didn't know that. So that, to me, is very deceptive. When you look at the map, you might think, oh, well, we can get that speed, but actually, maybe not.
And the notion of looking at what the library has versus what the community, what the average community member has, would take into account some economic and educational differences, which I think the library could play an important role in, obviously. So there's an important part of the story is in that. And if we had a system that gave us that kind of data in addition to our library data, we'd be able to better plan, wouldn't we?
Any other measures for this outcome? Any other?
Well, I would recommend taking a look at the basic needs of the community members. What are the basic needs of the community members as it relates to broadband? I mean, and if you can't define that, then just take that out.
Oh, I see, yeah.
Okay.
One sort of
Take that phrase, the last phrase.
sort of a different approach to a concrete way that the state library has looked at measuring bandwidth in the past relates less to these sort of national standards, which are very broad. I mean, there's 200 megs or a gig, depending on the size of your library. ALA for a while advocated for 5 megabits per connection, and we defined connection as the number of staff workstations, the number of public access workstations, and the average number of wireless connections, so someone bringing in a device on an hour in the library, those total connections would be the amount of bandwidth that would be sort of a necessary guiding standard for a library to meet. And for a lot of our libraries, it's far less than 100 megabits, but it's also probably more realistic about what their needs are, what they can afford, and really what's attainable.
That would also provide local libraries to kind of set their own service levels. If they, instead of saying you could do the first two measures, staff workstations, public fixed workstations, and then you could for the wide area network, local area network, you could say we're designing so that we want to be able to provide 80% of the time we want to be able to support 5 megabytes for this many users, or 100%, or 50%. That service level thing would be a useful kind of thing, and then the state library might at some point want to weigh in on what sort of an expected service level was, or guidance or something. But that would give libraries some. It's just like setting hours in a way, sort of local control and local say in that.
Yeah.
Instead of an arbitrary 50%.
Mm-hmm.
If you're going to provide 100% of access all the time, 24 7 by 24, then that's obviously way more expensive than providing 90%.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And that might be an interesting conversation to have.
Yes, that is true. Any other thoughts on this one? So the second part of this question in the memo, as you can see, I asked you, like, what would you need to see to say yes, we achieved the outcome. What I want to know from the NAC is what data and or information do you want to know about these along the way? And you could be pretty informal, because that's actually a pretty meaty question, but I think for me, I just want to know, like, do you want anything from me? Little checkpoints, like, along the way, saying, how's it going? How are we doing on achieving these outcomes? And if so, what do you want? Just a verbal report? Do you want specific measures? Something else? Or you just trust me and come back to you when I have information?
as a commissioner, at some level, I'm interested in what's going well, and you're not worried, so I'm not worried. And what is completely tanked and you're freaked out, so I should be mildly concerned as well. You know, kind of the green, yellow, red sort of measure. And actually, if you can't tell me that, then maybe we're not asking the right question. I don't know if the rest of the NAC members would have the same level of concern.
Other NAC members want to weigh in?
Examples are always helpful.
Examples of how it's going, or the data, or
Yeah, of successes or otherwise.
Carly says, I trust you, Tracy. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Wait, is that a winky face? Just kidding. It would be wonderful to kind of see the process as it happens, to document it as well as to see its projection and prepare thinking for the next step. That's good to know. I also like the idea of documenting the process. Any other things that would be useful to you? It's that time of day when it's hard to stay focused and do the deep thinking. Well,
I know that Jenny said it probably isn't probable, but to me, when I look at all these outcomes and how the library systems are working, I really wish you could at some point revisit having the legislature fund OCLC for everyone, or part of the shared catalog for everyone who uses, or some type of basis so you don't worry every year about whether or not you're going to have funding. I know for small libraries, it is an issue when their funding sources go up and down, and they would like to know that they could always be a member of the system.
that would be lovely.
Mm-hmm. I think the story that has to be told there is not about the individual service, but about what it means to be a part of this larger resource sharing community and everything that's included. I think where the state library always struggled in the past was talking about something like OCLC and cataloging and interlibrary loan, and the legislators' eyes would just glaze over. You know, they didn't want to fund the technology because they didn't understand it, or at least, you know, one barrier to them funding it was lack of understanding. And so when we talked about funding state aid, was something that was very understandable to them. It was an amount of money that was going to their libraries, to their communities, to be put to use by their librarians.
So what they were hearing,
And of course, go ahead, Bruce.
I was just saying what they were hearing wasn't the details about how this was happening. They were hearing, yes, Baker has sort of equal access to this core of important services as does Missoula. That's what they were hearing.
Yeah, and you know, the other issue, of course, is that our representatives change all the time. So, constant education of what we have, I'm sure, is an ongoing issue.
And you know, this is just a thought, but maybe we need to say to them, and you can help us get access for Baker and Weevil and Ecolacca by giving us this funding.
Yes, absolutely.
so that they realize the connection that they have to making it a reality. Carly said, good thoughts, Sonia. Building in meaningful and compelling tools for advocacy as well as gathering stories.
Yeah.
All right. Anything else that you need me to record about what you want to know about our work with these outcomes and how we're doing? Anything else that would be useful? If you think of anything on any of these, whether it's the success indicators or what you want to know, shoot me an email or give me a call and let me know. What I will do is at the end of the meeting, I will send you these documents to make sure that they're typed up and make sense, and have you review them, and just let me know if I need to make any changes or if there's anything you want to add to them. All right, we are coming up on our last kind of major agenda item, which is the Network Advisory Council's work plan. I'm just making a note here to send you the success indicators. So NAC members, back in August, you created this work plan. And it was built on the same model that we use in library development and actually in the entire state library of the logic model, with inputs, outputs, and desired outcomes and impacts. And this has kind of been in draft form since August. It's kind of my questions for you as you've had time to think about it is, are we ready to adopt it? What thoughts do you have? Is there anything we need to better define today? Are you actually ready to say scrap this work plan? We should actually do something different. If you're thinking it's still a valuable work plan and still something that you want to continue with, how are you going to make it happen? And it's okay to say, you know, we had great ideas, but now that we've been through this process, we'd like to change it. That's part of the learning process. If you were to pick one thing on this work plan that you're like, we must do this year, or we should do this, what would it be? So Carly Swaden says, I'm much more interested in the first two, promote interlibrary cooperation and develop budget for library development, than the last two. Any others want to weigh in? So Bruce, I asked the NAC members, kind of, as we've learned and gone through this process and are looking at their work plan, are they ready to adopt it? Or are they saying, you know what, we can't really do all of these? And if that's the case, what one or two things do they want to do from this work plan?
My thinking, unless not doing something is against the law, and we'd be sent to jail, which would be bad, that it would be better to pick fewer things and hit the ball out of the park than to hit a bunch of singles.
Yes.
Get it done right.
Yes, I agree. So, I mean, you know, NAC, you're volunteers. You can't do it all. Carly says, I can see where we can have impact on the first one. Honest question, what can we do to help with the second? No, that's a good question. For me, I think the thing I appreciate about having the NAC review the library development budget is having another set of eyes say, yeah, this is okay. Or maybe even to say, maybe not this year, but in the future, you need to really rethink this purchase or this project or this program. Having that sounding board is really helpful for me personally. Because really, it's your money, the library's money. That's how I see LSTA funding. It's for you and the patrons of the Talking Book Library. Any other comments or questions? And I don't mean to put you on the spot. There's nothing wrong with saying this work plan was pretty ambitious. Really, we can only do these two things.
The other thing that occurs to me, which is partially responsive to your question, not totally, sorry.
It's all right. It's a hard question.
It seems to me that the state library is sort of treading water, getting through difficult times, and it seems to me that anything we can do to promote staff members thriving during this period of treading water is probably a good idea. And just because something would be nice to do, if it costs too much in terms of just wearing staff out, I guess I would ask supervisors, you guys, to consider maybe taking it off the plate for a while. That's not to talk about the value of the item, but just in terms of, as a commissioner, again, not as a NAC member per se, but as a commissioner, I hope senior staff feels considerable latitude in deploying resources so that they can take into account that this is a distance race, not a sprint, and these are very tough times.
If I could jump in, I think we had a really good conversation around the potential barriers to adoption of different library development services, which I think gets at the heart of the first thing under promote interlibrary cooperation, that the NAC increases their knowledge about the gaps in service barriers. I think we've already had a conversation about how to pursue some of those outcomes very specifically, so it seems like we're already digging in and doing a little bit of that, and that's great. I think from there we might learn a lot about the kinds of questions that we might help NAC members ask of the types of libraries that you represent to help us learn even more from there. Kind of an iterative process to understanding how we can go about more concretely promoting interlibrary cooperation. So I think we're taking steps in that regard as it is.
I've kind of hesitated to weigh in because as chair, I know you can sometimes unduly influence people, but I think the NAC members can really make a difference with the promote interlibrary cooperation. And as I mentioned earlier, I really appreciate having you to talk through the library development budget part. So I do think those are two things where you certainly helped me, and I do appreciate that. I think the other things that advocate for net neutrality and support creation of master service agreements, I think those are kind of long-term things anyway, and if individual NAC members wanted to kind of help out, that could be something you could do, but as a body and as a whole, the first two are the ones where I think you could make a difference, and the first one is probably the hugest difference, because we kind of all have to come together to work together. But that's not to unduly influence you. It's just my thoughts.
A couple thoughts around the library development budget question. You know, we're sort of coming up on a new normal, perhaps, with our coal severance tax monies. You know, there's an increase in that appropriation again, and we're learning, as I said earlier, about cash flow with this new account. And potentially, if revenues hold for at least the next few years, we'll see increasing funds. You know, once upon a time, those were the monies that largely paid for our statewide databases. And it was the NAC that helped us make the hard decisions when we were losing those monies. And it'll be the opportunity of the NAC to help us think about what we do with any new monies that might exist. That's really challenging for us to think about, because I think there's some parameters we'll want to think about when we look at those monies. But that'll be something for us to look at when we look at the new library development budget.
Mm-hmm. So is anyone ready to make a recommendation on this work plan? Because wouldn't it be nice to not have it on every agenda? Any brave soul willing to make a motion one way or the other?
Well, I stepped out of the room. Did you take and cross anything off?
No one's committed to that yet.
Are there things, well, maybe ask it, do you have the resources to do all of these well?
That's what I'm asking the NAC members. In theory, this is their work plan, and they're saying this is what they would be doing.
Well, I'd be inclined to follow your recommendation, even though you didn't want to, you know, there's no undue influence here, but on the last, or not the last, advocate for net neutrality, that it could be more of an informal support. Mm-hmm. And I know when we had that, you know, the sign-on letter, I kind of had to explain that I can really sign on that being under the judicial branch and stuff. So for me, that would be an easy one to say, let's keep that informal.
So Carly says, I don't want to cut off anyone else or their thoughts. If we're good, I move that we adopt the first two and strike the last two.
I agree with Carly.
So we have a motion and a second that we adopt the first two dues for the NAC and strike the last two. Do we have any other discussion?
So just to understand it, are we talking about in the first table, page 1, 4?
Yes. So we're talking about the NAC will say they are going to keep the activity of promote interlibrary cooperation and develop budget for library development. And those will be their two duties for this year.
Just a question. When we've been discussing this develop budget for library development, and you describe it as more of a sounding board, so it's more of input, right? Or do you, okay.
Yeah.
So develop, it's not like from the ground up, it's just support. Okay.
Yeah.
So Tracy, can library development do the job well if NAC sort of shelves the last two?
I think there needs to be just a brief discussion of the last one, though.
Okay.
Because in my experience with the NAC, I think the state library has helped tremendously with setting up consortiums, with establishing cooperations. I see that as a really valuable skill of the Montana State Library, and a great service that they provide to the other libraries around the state. And I would hate to see the creation of a master service agreement, because I think it's a talent of the state library to be able to start those cooperations. I would hate to see that just completely fall off of the map. So even if it's maybe not the best place to have it on the NAC, that it's somehow still a focus.
And I think that is something that Jenny and Suzanne are sort of working towards. Their time.
It's
Stretched
a long-term goal.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Carly says, could the master service agreement be rolled into the first framework or be brought back next year?
I think it could definitely be brought back next year. I think part of the session that we're hosting at MLA to help us understand the barriers that are preventing libraries from applying for E-rate. Our goal is that helps inform how we invest staff time to support E-rate further for further adoption, or if the libraries there just say, you're doing everything you can and we're satisfied with that level of support, then using those resources in different ways. But I think once we have that information, it can help inform other kinds of collaborative opportunities like these kinds of master service agreements that may or may not include the use of E-rate to support those kinds of standard efforts.
So if you're okay with the long distance run, yes, it is there.
Yes. No, I'm satisfied.
Yeah, unless Helena can get her telco to talk to other telcos, and we can just get free access for our library.
That would be very impactful, Kellyanne. She says, I can try.
As a friendly amendment, could I suggest that the motion be to keep the first two, drop the second two, keep the first two, but table the second two to be revisited at the start of at some appropriate interval in the semi-near future? So instead of dropping and tabling and kind of re-examine?
Sure, I think that's appropriate because, this work was obviously important.
Yeah. Acceptable, friendly?
Yeah.
Yes. Carly is, okay, she says, I agree. Is there any further discussion or questions before I call for the vote? All right. All those in favor of the motion, which is to maintain on the NAC work plan, promote interlibrary cooperation, and develop a library development budget, and table advocate for net neutrality and support creation of master service agreement with ISPs. So we just do it this way. All of those in the room, if you are okay with that, please say aye.
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 And those of you online, you'll vote in chat, and I see some chats are coming in. So.
Aye.
In the motion, my intended amendment was to table but revisit sometime in the near future,
Thank you for clarifying that.
not table indefinitely.
Is there anyone in the room who is opposed to this motion? Please say nay. And is there anyone online who is opposed to this motion? Please type nay in the chat box. And are there any abstentions? Okay, looks like the motion carries. Thank you. So are there any other business or announcements? Oh, Elizabeth asked about the August retreat, when and where. Elizabeth, that is on the NAC's website, which I think you might even be able to get to with meeting dates. It is scheduled for August 14th, and it's here at the Montana Wild Center in Helena. That's typically where we have it, and it's usually just a day-long meeting. This year, one of the requests I have is to do the library futures, and that's that idea of the NAC being the think tank and telling us about where to go next. If you haven't done that, it's really interesting. You talk about societal trends, and it's usually at 9:30, Elizabeth. Almost all of the NAC's meetings start at 9:30. Are there any other questions or announcements?
if you're going to be at MLA on Wednesday, the commission is going to hold their April commission meeting at MLA that Wednesday at the Conference Hotel. I think it's in the Madison room. It's starting at 10 o'clock. It's always a great opportunity for folks to come and attend as a member of the public those commission meetings.
And is there any public comment on any matter not contained in this agenda, but within the jurisdiction of the Network Advisory Council? All right. May I have a motion to adjourn? Because you're actually big enough, I can't just say we're adjourned. Come on, that's the best motion.
So motion.
Sarah makes a motion to adjourn. Do I have a second?
I'll second.
Joanne seconds. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All right. Thank you, everyone. So we'll chat again in May, hopefully about library development's budget.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, I'll send out the notes.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Do we have the date already for the May meeting?
We do.
Let me make sure.